You will hear heavy rain at the beginning, making it seem like the sky is crying. The storm will calm down as the stories start. It may be hard to get through, but your support means a lot to us. Stress feels random and messy, but a story has a deliberate structure, a rhythm, and a destination. That predictability gives a tired mind a comforting sense of control and closure that real life often leaves out. When time stresses, stories heal. Hello, friends. I am Alex, and I am a no-sleep person just like you. Sometimes the night feels incredibly, deeply isolating, but on True Horror Stories film, we are a global family, staying awake together in the dark. These mysterious stories will build a protective, unbroken wall around your mind, keeping the stress of tomorrow completely at bay for your ultimate comfort. Subscribe and leave a like to support our sanctuary, and tell me below what is keeping you awake. You can let go now. Story 1. What the Hollow Keeps. There is a road out in McDowell County, West Virginia, and it does not act the way a road is supposed to act. It shows up on the map, sure, and it takes your tires and it carries you somewhere, but something about it feels wrong, feels off, feels less like a road and more like a choice being made for you. The paramedics who drive it at night, who have driven it on the long, cold, quiet shifts, will tell you, if you get them at the right moment, if you catch them when their guard is down, that Cutter Trace Road does not feel like it was built. It feels like it was waiting. Marcus Doyle is a paramedic, a good one, a careful one. He is also a man who finished a 12-hour shift, finished every last minute of it, before he drove home to bury his brother. He has carried those 40 minutes, those last 40 minutes, like a stone pressed flat against the center of his chest, for 6 whole years. He came back to McDowell County because he thought penance and purpose were the same thing, because he thought working in the place where Danny died would balance something, would settle some quiet debt. He is about to find out they are not the same thing, not even close. This is a story about a call, a simple dispatch call, that came from an address that should not have existed. It is about what the hollow keeps and what it gives back, and what it asks for quietly, patiently, in return. It is about grief, the kind that outlasts the person carrying it, the kind that settles into soil and timber and stone. And it is about whether a man who could not save his brother, can be trusted to recognize, when the moment finally comes, what saving actually costs. I have been trying to write this down, trying for almost 8 months now, and every time I sit at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the cursor blinking, I get up. I check the locks. I refill a glass of water I do not want. I stand at the window and look out at the parking lot for reasons I cannot name, and the cursor just sits there, patient as something that knows it has all the time in the world. I have started this 5 times. 4 of those times I wrote the date, October 19th, 2023, and then I closed the laptop and went to bed with the television on, low, just to fill the room with the sound of other voices. I am a paramedic. I have been one for 11 years, the last 4 of them on the night shift, out of McDowell County Emergency Services Station 4, which sits on a cracked road just outside Welch, West Virginia, wedged between a closed pharmacy and a concrete slab where a machine shop used to be. I am 36 years old. I know what death smells like, the specific sweetness of it, the way it clings to fabric and to the inside of your nose for hours after a call. I know the sound a body makes when it is deciding something the mind has not caught up to. I have held strangers' hands in their last minutes, and I have driven away from houses where I was not enough, and I have sat in the ambulance bay at 4 in the morning eating a gas station sandwich and staring at nothing, just waiting for the feeling to pass. None of that, none of 11 years of that, prepared me for the night shift in October. My name is Marcus Doyle. I grew up in McDowell County, born in Kimball, raised mostly in Bradshaw, which is the kind of small that you have to explain by referencing somewhere larger with which is itself still very small. My mother still lives on Cane Creek Road, in the house with the green aluminum siding and the propane tank in the side yard that my father painted the West Virginia state seal on as a joke, and then never repainted when the paint started to peel. When I took the job at Station 4, people from outside the county asked if it was hard coming back. I told them no. I told them it was familiar. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was that I came back because of my brother, because of Danny. Danny Doyle died in 2017. He was 31 years old, a former high school wrestler, a man who could fix almost any engine you put in front of him, and who made a sound like a seal barking when something was genuinely funny. And he died in a way that is common enough in this part of West Virginia that the county has a dedicated line on its health dashboard for it. I was in Charleston when my mother called, working trauma calls downtown, and I was 40 minutes from the end of my shift. I finished the shift. That is the thing I have never told anyone. The thing I have carried in the exact center of my chest, pressing against my sternum from the inside, ever since. I finished the remaining minutes. I stayed professional, I completed the rotation, and I drove home, and Danny was already gone. The night of October 19th began the way most nights at Station 4 begin. I clocked in at 6, poured a cup of coffee so old it had developed a surface texture, and sat down with my partner, Renata Oakes, to go over the shift log. Renata has been a paramedic for 14 years. And she is one of the most technically skilled people I have ever worked beside. She is also deeply, specifically superstitious, in the way that people who spend long enough in this work sometimes become not irrational, but calibrated, the way a sailor reads weather. She keeps a small piece of coal in her left breast pocket on every single shift. She will not discuss why. I have never asked. The early part of the shift was quiet, unremarkable. Ordinary. A chest pain call on Route 16 that turned out to be a man who had eaten an entire casserole of his neighbor's funeral potatoes on a bet and was experiencing the consequences. A welfare check on Barker Ridge Road, where an elderly woman had not answered her phone for 2 days and turned out to be fine, just annoyed. Her landline was unplugged because she was watching a miniseries and did not want to be interrupted. We transported her anyway, because she admitted the chest tightness she had been ignoring for a week probably warranted a look, and she scolded me gently the entire drive to the hospital, telling me I reminded her of her nephew Garrett, who also worried too much, and had ended up with an ulcer at 32. I ate a granola bar at 9:30, sitting in the ambulance bay with the big door rolled up, and the cold October air coming in off the hollow. The smell of McDowell County at night is its own thing, specific and distinctive. Wood smoke from the houses tucked up in the hills, the mineral dampness of the creek beds, something that is almost pine, but not quite, undercut by the particular cold that settles into hollow country after dark, a cold that feels closer to the ground than it should, a cold that knows where it is. I had grown up breathing that smell, and spent 6 years away from it, and come back to find it completely unchanged. Every component exactly where I had left it, as if the county had kept it in storage. Renata was inside, reading something on her phone. The radio was quiet. The wood smoke drifted through the bay, and I sat with my feet on the running board, and I thought, briefly, and without meaning to, about Danny. About 40 minutes. Then the call came in. The dispatcher's voice was calm, flat, professional, reading the address in a steady and even tone. 819 Cutter Trace Road. Unresponsive adult. Caller reporting difficulty breathing prior to loss of consciousness. Caller on scene. Renata appeared at my elbow before the dispatcher had finished, her jacket already on. Her expression the one she gets when something does not add up. Cutter Trace, she said. You know it? I said. She looked at the radio, then at me, then at the radio again. She touched the pocket where she keeps the coal. Get the map up, she said. and her voice was completely level, and I noticed she did not answer my question. I pulled the county map up on the console screen. Cutter Trace Road was there, a thin gray line extending off the back of Burdock Hollow Road, about 4 miles out of Bradshaw, climbing toward the ridge. I had driven Burdock Hollow Road 100 times, as a child and as a paramedic. I knew its branches. I could not recall Cutter Trace. We rolled at 9:47. The night had come down fully by then, the kind of dark you only get in hollow country, where the hills fold in on either side of the road and the sky narrows to a strip above you and the tree line on either side is absolute and lightless. Our headlights carved a corridor through it, and the road out of Welch was familiar for the first 6 minutes. And then we turned off toward Bradshaw, and familiar became something slightly different. Known in the way you know a childhood home you have not entered in years, where the muscle memory of the hallways is intact, but the rooms feel smaller than you remember them. Renata was navigating. She was quiet in the way she gets when she is working something out, turning it over. Station's been to Burdock Hollow before, she said, about 2 miles in. Cardiac, maybe 18 months ago. Old man named Pruitt. Right, I said. I remembered the name. The map shows Cutter Trace coming off Burdock maybe a mile past the Pruitt property, she said. I've driven Burdock a dozen times. I don't remember a turn. Roads branch off all the time up here, I said. Private drives that get put on the map eventually. Logging roads. She did not respond to that. She was looking at the screen. We turned onto Burdock Hollow Road at 9:53. The pavement narrowed to a single lane almost immediately. The hillside coming in close on the left, and the creek running just off the shoulder on the right. Invisible in the dark, but audible. A low, continuous sound that is one of the things I have always found, despite everything, genuinely comforting about this county. The creek just keeps going. Whatever else changes, the water does not stop. The headlights caught a mailbox, then the gap in the trees, Cutter Trace Road. It was there. A gravel lane, unmarked except for the depression in the vegetation where vehicles had turned before, climbing up and to the right at an angle that put it almost immediately out of sight of the main road. The gravel was pale in our lights, and the trees closed overhead almost at once, and there was a smell coming through the ventilation that I registered for one moment, and then my mind moved on from, because there was a call to run. The smell was coal dust and turned earth, faint and completely incongruous, and it reminded me of my father's work shed, and I registered it, and then I let it go. Something about that road was already asking me a question I did not yet know how to hear. The gravel under the ambulance tires made a sound like something being ground very slowly to powder. That is the first thing I remember about the climb up Cutter Trace. Not the dark, which was total and pressing on both sides of the lane, and not the way the tree canopy sealed overhead until our headlights were the only light that existed in the world, but that specific sound, deliberate, unhurried, as if the road itself were considering our weight and making a calculation about it. Renata had gone quiet in the way she goes quiet when she is watching for something and does not want to say yet what she is watching for. The scanner on the dash murmured its low, procedural language. We had been climbing for 4 minutes when I realized I had not once seen a structure, a light, a mailbox, or any sign that another vehicle had traveled this lane recently enough to leave a mark. How far does the address put us? I said. Renata checked the screen. 0.7 miles from Burdock. She paused. We are at 0.9. I slowed the ambulance. The gravel continued its sound. Could be a mapping error, I said. Could be, she said, in the tone she uses when she means the opposite. I called dispatch. The callback was attempted. No answer. The structure appeared at 1.3 miles in from Burdock Hollow Road, caught first in the upper edge of our headlights and then in the full beam as the lane leveled out into a wide flat space of packed dirt and dead grass. It was a house, or had been a house in some previous iteration of the word, a 2-story frame building.
white paint so weathered it had become a kind of gray, a porch running the full front width with the railing on the left side completely gone, and the right side leaning inward at an angle that suggested the intention of collapse rather than its actuality. 2 windows on the upper floor, both dark. 1 window on the lower left and a faint, uncertain light behind it. A light meant a person. A person meant we were in the right place. Renata was already reaching for her kit. "Wait," I said. She looked at me. I looked at the house. The light in the lower window was not the light of electricity. It was the irregular, warm and dim light of something slower. A candle, maybe, or a lamp with a dying battery. And it moved slightly, the way light moves when the source moves, and I watched it settle and thought about how long it had taken us to get here, and about the caller who had not answered the call back, and my mouth had gone dry in a way I attributed to the cold air and the long climb and nothing else. We got out. The cold hit immediately, a different cold from the county road below, deeper and more still. The kind of cold that has been sitting in one place long enough to become architectural. My breath came out white. The packed dirt under my boots was solid and made no sound, and the absence of the gravel noise after so long was disorienting in a way I could not immediately name. The porch steps held our weight. The first one complained briefly, a long, low creak that the night absorbed without echo. The front door was open by perhaps 4 inches, the gap showing nothing but interior dark, and the light we had seen from outside was visible now as a thin edge along the floor of a room to the left, a seam of amber beneath a closed interior door. Renata knocked on the door frame. Professional, measured 2 solid knocks. McDowell County Emergency Services. We received a call from this address. "Is anyone here?" The light behind the interior door shifted. Then a voice, not from behind the door, but from the interior dark directly in front of us, low and unhurried, with the specific vowel flattening of deep McDowell County dialect that I had grown up surrounded by and had spent years half forgetting, and now recognized with something I can only describe as a physical sensation in my chest, a loosening of something that had been held tight. "Come through," the voice said. "She is in the back room." We moved forward. My flashlight bounced off plaster walls with old paint peeling at the seams, exposed lath in places, a hardwood floor under a scatter of debris I did not examine closely. The interior door opened before we reached it, swinging inward with the slow authority of something that did not require assistance. The room beyond it was a sitting room, a single oil lamp on a table in the corner, the source of the amber light. A braided rug on the floor, faded to the color of old bruises. 2 chairs. And in the far doorway, standing at the entrance to a narrow back hallway, a woman in her 70s at least, possibly older, wearing a dark dress and regarding us with an expression I would describe, if pressed, as measured recognition, not surprise, not relief, but the look of someone who is sent for a specific thing and is now confirming that the specific thing has arrived. My partner introduced us. The woman listened without nodding, her hands folded together in front of her, her eyes moving between us with a deliberateness that felt less like assessment and more like remembering. "Who called for us?" Renata asked. The woman was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to make itself felt. "The girl in the back room," she said. "She is not breathing on her own." We went through the doorway. The back room was a bedroom, small, with a single window that faced the hill and therefore faced only dark. There was a bed, and in the bed there was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular in the specific way that requires immediate intervention. There was a glass of water on the nightstand that was full and had not been touched. There was a braided bracelet on the woman's right wrist, red and white cord, the kind children make at summer camps, and something about the specificity of it, the smallness of it against the stillness of the woman's arm, made my chest tighten in a way that was not clinical. Renata was already working. I moved to the other side of the bed, and we fell into the rhythm of a call the way you do when you have run enough of them with the same partner. Wordless, efficient, each of us knowing without discussion what the other was about to need. The older woman stood in the doorway. I wanted to ask how long the patient had been unresponsive. I turned to ask it, and the older woman spoke before I could form the question, her voice carrying from the doorway with the patient. Deliberate quality of someone who has chosen every word before the conversation began. She has been like this since just before dark, she said. She spoke at the end. She said a name. I looked up from the patient. Something in the way the woman said it made it not a statement to move past, but a statement to stay with. Whose name? I said. The oil lamp in the sitting room behind the woman put her face half in shadow. Her hands remained folded. She looked at me for a moment with that quality of measured recognition I had noticed when we first came in, and then she said, quietly, without any particular emphasis, the name. She said my brother's name. The room did not change. The temperature did not drop. No door moved on its own. Nothing in the physical environment shifted in any way I could measure or report. Renata continued working without looking up, her hands certain and practiced on the patient, and the oil lamp continued its patient amber, and the window facing the dark hill continued to show me nothing but dark. But something inside the room, inside the quality of the air itself, or inside my own understanding of what kind of call this was, changed in a way that is very difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, and that I have been trying to find language for across 8 months and 5 abandoned drafts. It was the feeling of a question that has been waiting in a locked room for 6 years, hearing a key. The woman in the bed had a pulse. It was there, thin, reedy, slower than I wanted, but present beneath my fingers at her wrist, a stubborn biological fact asserting itself against everything in the room that suggested otherwise. Renata had the oxygen mask positioned and was noting the respiratory rate in a voice so quiet it was barely above breath, and I was doing the secondary assessment with my hands on automatic, while my mind was still back in the doorway, still back in the moment the older woman had said the name, still turning it over the way you turn a stone you have found in an unexpected place and cannot immediately identify. Danny. Not a common name, but not impossible. Not impossible that a woman in a house at the top of a hollow in McDowell County would know a man named Danny. I told myself this. I used the word coincidence internally, the way you use a word when you are not quite ready to examine whether it applies. I stood up and turned to the doorway. The older woman was gone. Not gone in any dramatic sense. Simply absent from the frame where she had been standing, the way a person is absent when they have stepped quietly out of a room. I left Renata with the patient and went back through the interior doorway into the sitting room. The oil lamp was on the table in the corner, the same as before. The 2 chairs were the same as before. The front door remained partially open, the cold exterior air pressing through the gap with its mineral patience. What was different, in a way I needed several seconds to locate and name, was the table. There was something on it beside the lamp that had not been there when we came through. A glass jar, wide-mouthed, the old canning kind, sealed. Inside it, visible through the glass in the amber light, was a folded piece of paper. I stood looking at it. I was aware of being a paramedic on an active call, aware of all the protocols that governed my presence in this building, aware that touching unrelated objects at a scene is not among my responsibilities. I was also aware that my mouth had gone dry again, and that my hands, which I could feel at the ends of my arms, were very still. I did not touch the door. I went to the front door and looked out across the packed dirt to the tree line, and the dark and the lane disappearing downhill into the grip of the hollow. The cold pressed against my face and hands. I called for the woman. I said hello twice, projected into the dark, professionally. Nothing answered. I went back to Renata. The patient's vitals were stabilizing. Renata looked up at me with an expression that was not readable, in the way her expressions are sometimes not readable, not because she was hiding something, but because she was still processing it, and had not reached the stage of having an expression for it yet. "The woman who was in the doorway," I said. "She is not in the house." "There is a jar on the table in the sitting room," I said. "It was not there when we came through." This produced a silence between us that had weight and specific density, and that neither of us moved to fill immediately. Outside, the cold continued its architectural work against the structure. Above us, another creak from the second floor, slow and low, and then quiet. "We need to move her," Renata said, meaning the patient. "Yes," I said. We got the patient to the ambulance in 11 minutes. Renata rode in the back. I drove. I had to stop at the bottom of the lane, where Cutter Trace met Burdock Hollow Road, because a deer was standing in the road. An ordinary occurrence in McDowell County at any hour of the night. A thing that happens often enough that it does not register as remarkable. The deer stood in the headlights with the complete, depthless calm that deer have in headlights, and I held the brake and waited, and the deer did not move, and I looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds before I noticed that it was looking not at the headlights, but slightly past them, uphill, and to my left, back toward the direction we had come from. I looked in the mirror. The lane was dark. The trees were dark. The packed dirt clearing at the top of Cutter Trace was too far away to see from this angle and in this light, and I could not see it. And so I cannot tell you with certainty whether there was a figure standing in that clearing or not. The deer did not move for another full 30 seconds, and then it moved with sudden, quiet decisiveness off the shoulder and into the trees, and I pulled onto Burdock Hollow Road and drove. At the hospital, the receiving physician, a woman named Dr. Calloway, who had worked the county emergency department for 22 years and who had the particular economy of manner that comes from seeing everything and having time for the description of nothing, took the patient's chart and reviewed it and then looked up at me. "Have you run calls on Cutter Trace before?" she asked. The question landed differently than it should have. It did not feel like a standard orienting question. It felt like the second half of a sentence whose first half I had not been present for. "First time I have been to that address," I said. "First time I knew the road existed, Doctor." Calloway looked at the chart for a moment longer than was necessary. "There are a handful of addresses in this county," she said, her voice flat and clinical and completely controlled, "where we see presentations we cannot always account for." She handed the chart to a nurse without looking at it. "Not often, maybe once every couple of years." She looked at me directly. "The patients mostly do fine." "Mostly," I said. She held eye contact for one more second. Then she turned toward the patient bay. "Good work tonight," she said, in a voice that closed the conversation as definitively as a door. I went back to the ambulance. Renata was in the passenger seat, writing up her portion of the run report. She did not look up when I got in. We sat in the hospital parking lot with the engine running and the heater doing its modest work against the October cold, and neither of us spoke for a time that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. "She said his name," I said eventually. Not an accusation, not even a question, just the fact of it laid between us in the warm cab. Renata was quiet. She had put her pen down. "Danny has been gone 6 years," I said. "Nobody at that house knew me. Nobody should have known to say his name." Renata reached into her breast pocket. She held the small piece of coal between her fingers, not examining it, just holding it. The way people hold objects they have assigned weight to. She looked at the windshield. "There are people in this county," she said, choosing her words with a care that reminded me uncomfortably of Dr. Calloway, "who know things about the hollows that do not come from living in them the ordinary way." She paused. "My grandmother was one of them. She called it being acquainted with what the land holds." Another pause longer. She said the hollows remember everyone who has ever grieved inside them, and that sometimes when the grief is unfinished, the hollow finds a way to speak it back. She stopped. I waited. She said the hollow finds a way to speak it back, Renata said, to the person who needs to hear it. The heater ran its low mechanical note. The hospital parking lot spread its ordinary fluorescent-lit geometry around us, all concrete and painted lines and the small, reliable geometry of normal things, and I sat inside it and felt the distance between where I was sitting and the top of Cutter Trace Road, and the distance did not feel as large as 4 miles. I thought about the jar on the table, the folded paper inside it, the jar I had not touched. I thought about the 40 minutes. Whatever the house at the top of Cutter Trace held, it had known my name before I turned off Burdock Hollow Road, and I had the slow, certain feeling that the call I had answered tonight was only the first half of what had been dispatched. The patient's name was Loretta Vance. I learned this from the hospital intake record the following afternoon, when I stopped at the nurse's station and asked, with the casual professional tone of a paramedic following up on a previous call, how the woman we had brought in from Cutter Trace was doing. The nurse told me she was stable, resting, that the attending had not yet determined a primary diagnosis beyond acute respiratory compromise of unclear etiology, and that she had no listed next of kin and no emergency contact. He said her age, 34. I drove back to the station and sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes before going inside. I thought about Loretta Vance, 34 years old, no family listed, lying in a house at the top of a lane that had not existed in my memory of this county until the dispatcher read the address aloud. I thought about her right wrist, the red and white braided bracelet. Danny had made one of those at church camp the summer he was 12. He had worn it until the cord frayed, and then he had kept it in the cup holder of his truck. And when we cleaned out his truck after the funeral, I had put it in my jacket pocket and later transferred it to a drawer in my bedside table, where it still was, in the same position, in the same fold, because I had never been able to decide what to do with it, and not deciding had become its own long-term decision. I was not saying the bracelets were the same bracelet. I want to be precise about that. Red and white braided cord bracelets are not rare. I was not making a claim. I was noting that it had registered, and that the inventory was getting longer. That evening, before my shift began, I drove out to Bradshaw. My mother was in the kitchen when I came through the back door, and she said my name without turning around in the way she has always been able to identify my particular entry into a room. She poured a second cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the kitchen table and sat down across from it, which meant she was expecting a conversation. I sat. I held the cup. "Do you know a woman named Loretta Vance?" I said. My mother's hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to her coffee cup. She did not pick it up. She looked at it. "Loretta," she said. The name came out with a quality I cannot precisely categorize, not recognition exactly, not surprise exactly, but the sound of a word that has been stored somewhere for a long time and retrieved carefully. "She was a patient last night," I said. "We pulled her from a house on Cutter Trace Road." My mother looked up from her coffee cup. The kitchen light above us was the same fixture that had been there since my childhood, an overhead globe of frosted glass that cast a warm and slightly yellowed light across the table, and in that light my mother's face had the particular quality of a person who is deciding something rapidly and quietly. "Cutter Trace," she said. "You know it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the propane tank in the side yard sat in the early dark, my father's faded state seal just barely visible in the dimming light, and I looked at it the way I sometimes look at it, as a way of locating myself in time. "Your father knew that road," my mother said. "He drove it once, years before you were born, on a call. He was volunteering with the county rescue then, before the service professionalized." She paused. "He did not talk about it often, maybe twice in all the years I knew him. The second time was the week before he passed. My father had been dead for 9 years. He had worked coal for 22 years and then retired and spent 11 more years doing everything he had meant to do while he was working. And then his heart had stopped on a Tuesday morning in his workshop while he was restoring a neighbor's lawnmower engine. And the neighbor had found him 2 hours later, and his hands were still on the engine when they found him, still positioned as though he had simply paused to think. "What did he say about the road?" I said. My mother turned her coffee cup a quarter rotation. This is a thing she does when she is going to say something she has decided to say, despite having reservations about saying it. I have seen the gesture my entire life, and I have learned to wait for it to complete before speaking. He said the house at the top of it had been there longer than any living person's memory, she said. He said the woman who lived in it, and he described an older woman, Marcus, much older than anyone he could account for, had asked him questions about his family, about who he had lost. He said she knew things she should not have been able to know. Another quarter rotation of the cup. He said, the house felt like a place that was doing something, not a place where something had happened, a place actively engaged in a purpose. I thought about the oil lamp, the deliberate amber of it, the folded paper in the sealed jar. Did he say what purpose? I said. My mother was quiet for long enough that the refrigerator in the corner cycled on and ran through half its operational cycle before she answered. He said it was a keeping place, she said. That was the phrase he used, a keeping place. He said the woman who lived there held grief the way a well holds water, not as a burden but as a function, as what she was built for. She looked at me directly. He said she asked him about his father, who had died in the mines in '58, and that she knew things about his father's last shift that my husband had never told another person in his life. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator finished its cycle. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly down Cane Creek Road, and its headlights passed across the window above the sink in a smooth arc, illuminating nothing particular and receding. She said Danny's name, I said. The woman in the house. When we arrived, before she had any reason to know who I was, she said Danny's name. My mother did not look surprised. She looked, instead, like a person receiving confirmation of something they had been holding at arm's length for a long time, and had now been asked to draw closer. Your brother grieved in this county, she said. He was born here, and he lived here, and he died here. And his grief, his own grief, Marcus, the grief he carried before the end that belongs to the land as much as his name does. She paused. There are people in these hollows who believe that grief does not disperse, that it settles into soil, into structures, into the specific geography of the places where it was felt most intensely. She looked at her hands. Your father believed that, quietly. He never made a production of it, but he believed it. I had not known this about my father. That is the thing that landed most heavily as I sat at the table where I had eaten every childhood meal. Not the content of what my mother was telling me, not the woman on cutter trace, not the jar or the paper or the name spoken in a dark doorway, but the fact that my father had driven that lane and spoken to that woman and come home carrying something he had folded quietly into the interior of himself and never fully shared, and that I had known him for 27 years and had not known this part of him existed. The not knowing felt like a room I had walked past every day without noticing the door. I drank the rest of my coffee. It had gone cold while we talked. The jar, I said. There was a jar on the table in the sitting room. Something folded inside it. I did not touch it. My mother was quiet for a moment. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen her use before. Not quite concern, not quite recognition, but something located between them. Your father came home from that road with a jar, she said. The refrigerator was silent. The propane tank sat in the side yard with its fading seal. He kept it in his workshop, she said, on the shelf above the engine he was restoring when he died. When we cleaned out the workshop, I found it. I did not open it." She paused. "I still have it, Marcus. I have had it for 9 years in the back of the hall closet, and I have opened that closet every day for 9 years, and I have never once been able to make myself throw it away." She stood up. She went to the hall closet. The sound of the closet door, the specific wooden complaint of it swinging on old hinges, was a sound I had heard 10,000 times in my life and had never once found remarkable until this moment, when it seemed to be the hinge of something considerably larger than a closet door. She came back with a wide-mouthed canning jar, sealed. Inside it, visible in the kitchen light, was a folded piece of paper. The paper was the color of old bone. I looked at the jar, and the jar sat on the table between us, and the kitchen light fell across it with its warm, yellowed patience, and I became aware, sitting in my childhood kitchen with my living mother across the table and my dead father's jar between us, that the road at the top of Cutter Trace had been running a much longer errand than last night's call. It had not sent for me. It had been waiting for me to be ready to come. Outside, the dark had come down completely over Cane Creek Road, and somewhere in the hills behind the houses, the hollow country was doing what it does in October, breathing in, pulling the cold close, settling into the deep and patient work of keeping what it has been given to keep. She was awake. This was more than I had prepared myself for. When I came to the room, I had been mentally rehearsing the scenario of finding her still unconscious, a quiet room, monitoring equipment, the impersonal hum of a hospital working on a person without the person's participation. Instead, she was sitting up in the bed at an angle of perhaps 45 degrees, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking out the window at the gray October morning, with an expression of such complete and quiet exhaustion that it was less an emotion than a condition, a state the face had settled into the way terrain settles after long weathering. She looked at me when I came in. She did not appear surprised. "You brought me in," she said. Her voice was low, measured, with the specific flatness of someone who has not yet decided how much energy the conversation is worth. "My partner and I said. "I wanted to check that you were doing all right." She looked at me for a moment with an assessment that was not unfriendly, but was thorough. Her right hand rested on the blanket, and the red and white bracelet was still on her wrist. "You went into the sitting room," she said, "after you found me." It was not a question. I had not told her this. She had been unconscious for the entirety of our interaction at the house. There was no other woman in that house, she said. The hospital room held its sterile, temperature-controlled air around us. A monitor beeped its patient rhythm at the bedside. "She spoke to us in the doorway," I said. "She said you had spoken a name before losing consciousness." Loretta turned back from the window. She looked at me with an expression I have been trying to describe accurately for 8 months and keep failing, because it contained too many things simultaneously: grief and recognition and the specific quality of a person confronting something they have been circling for a long time and have finally arrived at the center of. "I have been going to that house for 3 years, she said, "since my son died." Her voice did not fracture. It stayed level with the precision of someone who has said the sentence enough times that the saying of it no longer breaks the surface, even when what is beneath it has not changed at all. "He was 4 years old. His name was—" She stopped. She looked at her wrist, at the bracelet. "His name was Daniel," she said. The monitor beeped. The gray light from the window lay across the blanket and across her hands and across the bracelet on her wrist in the particular flat way of October light that makes everything it touches look both very real and very fragile. I sat down in the chair beside the bed, without being invited, and without deciding to, my body completing the action before my mind authorized it, and I looked at the bracelet and thought about a drawer in my bedside table, and about a jar on a kitchen table, and about a man who died with his hands still on an engine, and a boy who died at 31 and a 4-year-old named Daniel, and I felt the grief of this county, all of it, the layered and accumulated weight of it, press against the inside of my chest with a force that was not violent but was total, the way water pressure is total at depth, present in every direction simultaneously. "I know that name," I said. I was not sure, saying it, which Daniel I meant. I was not sure it mattered. Outside the hospital window, the October sky pressed its gray weight down over McDowell County, and somewhere in the hills to the north, along a gravel lane that climbed into the dark and did not appear on any map I had checked before last night, a house sat in its clearing and held what it had been given, patient and deliberate, and waiting with the particular quality of a thing that has learned that the people it needs always come back. Loretta Vance had found the house the way people in deep grief sometimes find things, not by looking, but by stopping looking, by reaching the specific exhaustion point at which the mind releases its grip on direction and simply follows whatever pulls. Her son Daniel had died in the spring of 2020, a Saturday morning in April, a congenital heart condition that had been monitored and managed, and that everyone involved had treated as a controlled variable right up until the morning it was not. She told me this in the measured, precise way that people describe the deaths of their children. After enough time has passed, that the rawness has been replaced by something harder and more permanent, not healed, but structural, the way scar tissues is structural, present in every movement without requiring acknowledgement of itself. She had been a nurse at the county facility, she told me, for 6 years before Daniel died, and had not returned to work after. She had been living, for the past 3 years, in the house at the top of Cutter Trace Road. That stopped me. "Living there?" I said. "The house has no power," I said. "No running water that I could see. It is." I chose the word carefully. "It is not in a condition for occupation." Loretta looked at me with something that was almost patience and almost something else. "The house is in exactly the condition it needs to be in," she said. "I have a wood stove in the back room, a well with a hand pump in the yard on the east side that you would not have seen coming up the lane. I have what I need." "Who called 911?" I said. She looked at her hands, at the bracelet. "I did," she said. "Earlier in the evening before I lost consciousness. I called from the landline." She paused. "The line has not worked in 2 years. I tried it because I had nothing else, and it connected, and I gave the address, and then I do not remember anything else until I woke up here. A disconnected landline that connected when she needed it. I added this to the inventory I was keeping, the growing list of things about Cutter Trace Road that required a different kind of accounting than the kind I had been trained to perform. "The older woman," I said. "You told me there was no other woman in the house." "There was not," Loretta said. "Not a living one." She said this with the same level, uninflected tone she had used for everything else, as a simple statement of condition rather than a claim requiring defense, and the lack of performance in it was more persuasive than any argument she could have constructed. "She finds the name that matters most to the person she is speaking to, and she uses it as a door," Loretta said. "When I first came to the house, 3 years ago, she said Daniel's name before I had told her anything about myself. I had driven up that lane on a Tuesday night in November, no destination in mind, just driving because sitting still had become unbearable, and I ended up on Burdock Hollow Road, and then I saw the turn, and I took it, and I climbed to the top and knocked on the door." She paused. She was already in the doorway when I got to the porch. She said my son's name, and I sat down on the porch steps, and I did not move for a long time, and when I finally stood up, she brought me inside. "Her name," I said. "Did she tell you her name?" Loretta was quiet for a moment. "She told me to call her Cora," she said. She said names were useful, but imprecise, and that Cora was the name people in the Hollow had used for longer than she could accurately account for. She looked at me directly. I stopped asking clarifying questions after the first few weeks. The questions felt beside the point. She keeps things, I said. Grief. That was the word my mother used. A keeping place. Loretta's expression shifted in the small, controlled way it had been shifting throughout our conversation. She holds what the hollow is given, she said. That is how she described it to me. She said grief in these mountains does not behave the way grief does in flat country. She said the terrain holds it the way the terrain holds water. It follows the channels, it collects in the low places, it does not evaporate cleanly. She paused. She said her function was to make the collected grief available, to return it to the people it came from in a form they could finally carry. The jars, I said. Loretta looked at me with an expression that was the first expression she had shown with any warmth in it, a small and careful warmth, the warmth of a person recognizing that the conversation has arrived somewhere she has been trying to get to. The jars, she said. She said the jars were for the person the grief belonged to, that Cora holds it until the right person is ready. That readiness is not a decision, but a convergence. The person has to arrive at the point where the grief and the truth of it and the willingness to receive it exist simultaneously. She said it cannot be forced. She said Cora has held some things for decades waiting. What is in the jars? I said. Loretta was quiet for long enough that the monitor completed several full cycles of its rhythm. The truth of the grief, she said. Not a letter, not a message. Cora described it to me once as, she said it was the part of the grief that the person who died was holding on behalf of the person who survived, the weight the dead were carrying for the living, that the living did not know was being carried for them. She looked at her hands. She said the dead sometimes hold things that the living need and cannot access while the dead are still alive to hold them. And when the dead are gone, the thing has nowhere to go. So the hollow holds it, until the person can receive it. The jar on the sitting room table, I said. Is it there for me? Loretta looked at me with the warm and careful expression she had used when I said the word jars. Cora puts nothing on that table by accident, she said. She does not perform gestures. Everything she does is a precise response to a precise need. She paused. You will know when you are ready to go back. How will I know? She turned her face toward the window. The gray light accepted her the way gray light accepts everything, without comment, without preference, with the absolute democracy of a sky that has been covering this county for longer than any name on any headstone. You will stop being afraid of what is in it, she said. That is always how you know. I went back on a Thursday, not because Thursday held any particular significance, and not because I had arrived at the clarity Loretta described, the absence of fear she said would mark the moment of readiness, but because I had spent 4 days oscillating between the decision and its opposite, and had finally recognized the oscillation itself as a form of the same avoidance I had been practicing for 6 years, wearing different clothes. The 40 minutes had been avoidance. The move to Charleston had been avoidance. The years of clean professional competence, the careful maintenance of a self that functioned well under pressure and disclosed nothing that was not strictly necessary, all of it had been a version of finishing the shift before driving home. Efficient, controlled, and in the way that all controlled things are eventually controlled by what they are controlling against, entirely shaped by Danny's absence. I stopped at my mother's house on the way. The jar was on the kitchen table when I came in. She had taken it from the hall closet sometime in the previous days and placed it where the morning light from the east window could reach it, and in the full daylight, the paper inside it was visible in detail for the first time, the fold precise and even, the paper old enough that its edges had taken on the particular amber of age, the specific warm yellowing of something that has been kept in the dark for a long time. My mother sat across from it. She did not sit across from me. She sat across from the jar, as though the jar were the relevant presence and I were the occasion. I picked it up. The glass was cool the way glass is always cool, not cold, not alarming, simply the temperature of an object that does not generate its own warmth. I turned it in my hands. The seal on the lid was intact, the old rubber gasket still compressed, doing the work it had been manufactured to do across however many decades it had been doing it. I set it down on the table. "I need to open it at the house," I said. "I think that is what is supposed to happen." My mother looked at the jar for a moment and then at me. She nodded once, the specific nod of a person confirming something rather than agreeing to something. I put the jar on the passenger seat of my truck, in the footwell, wedged against the seat base so it would not shift on the curves. And I drove north out of Bradshaw on the county road and then onto Burdock Hollow Road, and the hills came in on either side, and the October light came through the trees in the particular slanted way of late morning in hollow country, making long pale geometries across the road surface that moved as the branches moved above them. I found the turn without hesitation. This surprised me. The gap in the trees was simply there, the way a familiar turn is there, visible before I was looking for it, as though the lane had been anticipating my approach and had arranged itself accordingly. The gravel made its sound under the tires. The trees closed overhead. The clearing at the top was changed by daylight, not smaller or larger, changed in quality. At night it had been a negative space, dark surrounded by darker dark. In the daylight it was a positive space, a genuine clearing of perhaps half an acre. The dead grass pale and flattened by the season, the tree line on three sides standing at a distance that felt considered rather than accidental, as though the clearing had been made with intention, and the trees had honored the intention across however many years they had been growing. The house sat in the clearing center with the specific gravity of a structure that has been in one place long enough to become the place rather than merely occupying it. I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine off. The clearing was very quiet, not the aggressive quiet of a space that has expelled sound, but the ambient quiet of a place that has been quiet long enough to have a texture to it, a depth, quiet as a quality of the air rather than as an absence of its opposite. I could hear the faint movement of branches at the tree line and, very distantly, the creak at the bottom of the hollow going about its permanent business. I got out. I took the jar. I raised my hand to knock. The door opened before I completed the motion. Cora stood in the doorway. In daylight, she was more specific than she had been on the night of the call. Her hair was white and pinned at the back of her neck. Her eyes were the gray-green of creek water in November, a color that is neither one thing nor the other but is entirely itself. She was wearing the same dark dress. Her hands were at her sides. She looked at the jar. She looked at me. "Marcus Doyle," she said, not a greeting, a confirmation. The way you confirm an address before signing for something. "You know my name," I said. "I know your family," she said. "3 generations of Doyle grief have come through this hollow. You are the latest installment." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." I put my father's jar on the table between us. She looked at it with an expression that I can only describe as tender, not sentimental, not performed, but the specific tenderness of a person reuniting with something they have cared for in its owner's absence and are now prepared to return. She folded her hands in her lap. "Your grandfather," she said, "died in the Ekman mine, 1958. His name was Robert Doyle, and he was 41 years old, and he died knowing something about your father that he had never found the language for while he was alive." My hands were very still on the arms of the chair. "Your father came here as a young man," she continued, "not yet 25, still raw with it, and I was ready to give him what Robert had left, and he was not ready to receive it." She said this without judgment. The unreadiness is never a failing. It is simply a condition of timing. The grief and the person have to ripen together. She looked at the jar. He took the jar. He kept it close. Close is a kind of readiness, even when opening is not yet possible. "He kept it in his workshop," I said. above the engine he was working on. Of course he did, she said simply. He kept it near his hands. His hands were the part of him most willing to receive difficult things. He just did not live long enough to bridge from the hands to the rest. Something moved in my chest, not dramatically, not the way grief moves in stories, the sudden breaking of a surface, more the way a long-standing pressure shifts when a structural element elsewhere adjusts, a transfer of load rather than a release of it. And Danny, I said. My voice came out level. I was surprised by this. Cora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the jar, and then at me with the creek water eyes, and I held the eye contact because looking away felt like the 40 minutes, a manageable alternative to the thing that could not be managed. Your brother carried something for you, she said, from the last years. He understood something about why you left McDowell County, and he understood something about what leaving cost you. And he carried that understanding the way people carry things for loved ones who are not yet ready to carry them themselves. She paused. He was not able to give it to you before he died, so it came here. Is it in the jar? I said. The jar holds your grandfather's piece, she said. What Danny left is. She stopped. She stood. She went through the interior doorway, and I heard her in the back of the house, moving with the unhurried footfall of a person performing a familiar task, and I sat in the sitting room and held my father's jar in both hands and looked at the unlit oil lamp and thought about my father sitting in this same chair, holding this same jar, unable to open it. Cora came back into the room. She was carrying something small in her closed right hand. She sat down and opened her hand and placed it on the table beside the jar. It was a piece of coal, not exceptional, not decorated. A piece of coal approximately the size of a large walnut, rounded at some edges and faceted at others, with the specific matte darkness of coal that has been handled and held in a palm with the warmth and pressure of held things. This piece had been held. The surfaces that had contacted skin were slightly different from the surfaces that had not. I looked at it. My hand reached for it before I had decided to reach. The moment my fingers closed around it, the cold of it moved up through my palm and into my wrist and into my arm, and I understood, not in language, not in images, but in the direct bodily way that the deepest knowledge arrives, that Danny had known. He had known about the 40 minutes. He had known that I chose to finish the shift, and he had not been angry. He had understood it the way Renata's grandmother had understood her 30 minutes, as the last interval of a world where the person was still alive, the final exercise of a love that did not yet know it was about to become only a memory. He had understood this, and he had been unable to tell me, and so he had given the understanding to the hollow to hold until I was ready to receive it. My brother had absolved me, not with words, not with a letter, with a piece of coal rounded by someone else's handling and now in my hands, and with the pacific weight of it, almost nothing, and entirely everything. The oil lamp was unlit, and the daylight came through the window at the front of the room, and the hollow held its October quiet, and I sat with my dead brother's absolution in my hand, and I did not perform anything. I did not cry in any cathartic way. I simply breathed in and out, with the coal in my palm and the jar on the table and Cora across from me watching with the creek water eyes of someone who has sat with this specific kind of moment more times than any living person should have had to, and who does it anyway, and who does it with a grace that is not kindness exactly, but is something older and more necessary than kindness. The air in the room had changed, not temperature, not anything measurable, but the quality of the silence was different from the silence I had walked into. The way a room feels different after a window is opened, even if you cannot feel the air moving. Something had been received. Cora opened my father's jar. She did not ask. She simply reached across the table with the unhurried authority of someone performing a task that is precisely within their jurisdiction, and her fingers found the lid and turned it, with the single practiced motion of a person who has opened a great many sealed things, and the rubber gasket released with a sound so small it was barely a sound at all, more a change in the pressure of the room than an audible event. And she set the lid on the table beside the jar and sat back. She did not reach inside. She looked at me. I reached into the jar and took out the folded paper. It was lighter than I expected. Paper always is. I held it for a moment without unfolding it. The surface of it was dry and slightly textured with age, the fold lines deep and permanent, the kind of folds that form when paper has been in one position long enough to forget any other. I unfolded it. The paper was blank. Not blank in the sense of empty, blank in the sense of a surface that holds something that does not require writing to be present, the way certain materials hold heat long after the source is removed. I looked at it for a long time. The daylight from the front window moved across it as the morning shifted, and in the movement of the light I became aware of something in the texture of the paper itself, a faint variation in its surface, not writing, not image, but the ghost of an impression, the specific pattern left by a hand that had pressed flat against it, a large hand, broad across the palm, with the particular wear pattern of a man who had worked with his hands for decades. My grandfather's hand. Robert Doyle, dead at 41 in the Ekman mine, pressing his palm flat against this paper in whatever act or moment had constituted the deposit of what he had needed to leave, not a message in language, but the physical fact of contact, the proof of presence, the most fundamental communication available to a man whose working life had been conducted almost entirely through his hands. I pressed my own palm against it. The paper was room temperature, and then, very gradually, something shifted at the surface. Not warmth exactly, not cold, but the specific neutrality of two temperatures meeting and negotiating. The way a handshake is the negotiation of two bodies' heat. I held my palm flat against it, and I thought about my father's hands on the engine, positioned at the moment of his death, as though the work were simply paused. And I thought about my grandfather's hands in the mine. And I thought about my own hands on patients across 11 years of calls, hands trained to find pulses and establish airways and apply pressure to the specific geography of damage, hands that had been very useful and very busy, and that had failed on one particular Tuesday to drive north for 40 additional minutes. Cora spoke. "Your grandfather's knowing," she said, "was this. Your father blamed himself for the shift your grandfather worked the day he died. Your father had been scheduled for that shift. He traded it to be at a school event for your uncle, who was 8 years old and receiving some kind of recognition." She paused. "Your grandfather took the shift without complaint and died in it, and your father spent the rest of his life understanding that he had traded his father's life for an afternoon in a school gymnasium." The room was very still. "Your grandfather left this so that your father would know it was not a trade," she said. "He left it so your father would know that a man who worked in the Ekman mine in 1958 understood that every shift carried what it carried, and that the shift he took was not a punishment distributed to your father, but simply the shift he took, and that he took it freely, and that he went into that mine with nothing unfinished between them." She looked at the blank paper in my hands. "He was not able to give your father that knowing while he was alive, so he left it here. I thought about my father keeping the jar above his engine for 9 years, the jar 6 inches from his hands every day in the workshop, the jar he was not able to open, the jar my mother had kept in the hall closet for another 9 years, as though the jar had understood that the grief was not yet done traveling and had arranged to be kept available. 4 generations of Doyle men, and the same architecture of guilt, the surviving one, the one who was elsewhere, and the one whose absence from the specific moment of catastrophe had been rewritten by grief into causation. My grandfather's shift, my father's gymnasium, my 40 minutes. The same room, entered through different doors. I refolded the paper along its existing lines. I put it back in the jar. I put the lid back on and did not tighten it, leaving it resting rather than sealed, available rather than closed. I picked up the piece of coal and held it in my left hand, and I sat in the chair in Cora's sitting room, and I felt the specific quality of a weight that has not been removed but has been redistributed, shared across more points of contact so that no single point bears the full load of it. I was not healed. I want to be precise about this because imprecision would be its own kind of failure. The 40 minutes did not cease to exist. My brother was still dead. My grandfather was still dead. My father was still positioned over an engine on a Tuesday morning. And none of the facts of the situation had altered. What had altered was the architecture, the way the facts connected to each other, the load-bearing relationships between them. The guilt had been load-bearing. It had been holding up a structure I had built without choosing to build it, a structure that required the 40 minutes to be a causation rather than grief, required me to be culpable rather than simply surviving, because culpability at least made sense of the timeline, gave it a logic, and kept it from being the thing it actually was. A sequence of events that happened to people who loved each other and were imperfect and did not know what was coming. I thanked her. She accepted this the way she accepted everything, without performance, without deflection, with the simple direct acknowledgement of a person who knows the value of what they do and does not require the acknowledgement but does not refuse it either. I walked back through the sitting room. I went through the front door and across the porch and down the steps that creaked their single note and across the packed dirt clearing to my truck. The October light was at its midday angle by then, coming through the amber and red of the tree line with the specific generosity of autumn light in hollow country, laying itself across the clearing without preference or reservation, illuminating everything equally and without drama. I put my father's jar on the passenger seat. I put the piece of coal in my jacket pocket against my chest. I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The house sat in its clearing behind me with the gravity of its purpose, the chimney showing a thin thread of smoke that rose and dispersed in the still air, and a window caught the midday light and gave back the tree line, and nothing about it advertised what it was or what it held or what it had given back this morning to a man who had arrived at the top of a hollow lane, carrying 6 years of a weight he had been too afraid to name. I started the truck. I drove down Cutter Trace Road, with the windows down, the October air moving through the cab, carrying its mineral cold and the specific smell of leaves returning to earth, and the gravel made its sound beneath me all the way to the bottom. And at Burdock Hollow Road, I turned south toward Bradshaw, toward my mother's kitchen, toward the ordinary world. The coal was warm in my pocket by the time I reached the county road, warm with carried heat, warm the way a kept thing is warm when it has finally been received, and I drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand flat against my jacket where it rested. And the hills on either side of the road were red and amber in the midday light, and they were very beautiful, and I let them be. Months later, Renata noticed the change before I named it to her. We were on a call in early November, a straightforward respiratory case in the north end of the county, and afterward in the ambulance bay she was writing her report, and I was cleaning the kit, and she said, without looking up from her report, "You are different." "Better or worse?" I said. She looked up. She examined me with the clinical attention she brings to assessments. "Neither," she said, "just present." She returned to her report. "You were always technically here. Now you are actually here." I went back to the house, I said. She did not look up again, but her pen slowed slightly on the page. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" She touched her breast pocket, the pocket with the coal. "Because you stopped carrying the weight of the thing you were carrying. I can see it in how you stand." She paused. My grandmother described it the same way about people who had been to the right places and received the right things. She said they stopped leaning. I opened the laptop that night. I put the cursor in the blank document. I wrote the date, October 19th, 2023. Then I wrote the first sentence. I have been trying to write this down for almost 8 months. This is the account you are reading. Epilogue. The message A text from Loretta came on the last Saturday of March as I turned onto the county road, driving home in the late afternoon. 2 sentences, no preamble, no closing. The jar opened this morning. I am ready to come down from the hill. I read it twice. I set the phone on the passenger seat and drove, and the afternoon kept its long light over the county for another hour before it finally gently let the dark come in. The forsythia along Cane Creek Road was still bright in the low light, still doing its unreserved yellow along the full length of the road, and I drove past it slowly enough to let it be what it was. And it was very yellow, and the light was very long, and somewhere on a ridge above Bradshaw a piece of coal sat against the sealed face of a mine that had been closed for 60 years, keeping company with a mountain that had been keeping company with everything else for considerably longer than that. The hollow does not hurry. The hollow has never needed to. It holds what it is given, and it gives back what can be received, and it keeps the rest quietly, patiently, in the dark between the hills, until the time is right, until the person is ready, until the road and the person and the weight all arrive at the same place at the same moment, and the door, the old door, the door that has always been waiting, finally opens. Story 2. What the Sky Kept. When time strips everything down to its most honest bones, what remains is not the things we owned, not the arguments we won, not even the prayers we said correctly, but the way someone's hands felt against ours in the moments we did not know would be the last ones. This is a story about 2 women. One of them survived something that no law of nature should have permitted, and came out of it changed in a way she could not name at first. The other woman died the way she had chosen to live, on her own terms, in her own bed, in the dress she had picked herself. They did not know each other. They lived in different parts of the country. But grief, it turns out, does not respect geography, and the big thicket, which has swallowed more human stories than any county newspaper ever recorded, sometimes gives things back. Not always in the form they were given. This is that kind of story. The mower had a loose something in the steering, a small drift to the right that Marlene had been meaning to have looked at since April, and by late July she had stopped noticing it entirely. The way you stop noticing the crack in a ceiling once enough months have passed and nothing has fallen through. She was on the back section of the property, the 6 acres her family had held since before anyone living could say precisely when, and the evening was doing what East Texas evenings do in that particular 3rd week of July, which is to say it was sitting on everything like a damp wool coat that someone had left in a truck bed during a rain, and she was 3 hours into a job that should have taken 2, and her water jug had gone warm on the footrest, and none of this was remarkable. What was remarkable was the sky. She noticed it, the way you notice something that has no right to be noticed, the way your eye catches a color that does not belong in a room before your brain has decided what to do about it, which is to say she noticed it without quite knowing she had noticed it. A slight heaviness in the air above her that had no meteorological explanation, because the clouds were 3 counties east and moving away from her, and the only bird she could see was a red-tailed hawk working a lazy thermal 200 feet up, and she watched it for a moment the way a person watches something beautiful before they understand that beauty is not what is happening. She was thinking, at that moment, about her sister. She did not want to be thinking about her sister. She had been thinking about her sister since March, since the phone call, since the airport, since standing in the doorway of a room in a house outside Austin, and understanding in the specific cellular way that the body understands things before the mind agrees. that the person in the bed was not the same person who had always been in that bed, was not the same person who had taught Marlene to braid her own hair, was not the same person who had driven 300 miles once at 2 in the morning, because Marlene had called crying and had not been able to explain why, was becoming, with a gentleness and a patience and a horror that Marlene had not been prepared for, someone who was already leaving. Delia had been sick for 8 months by then. The hawk turned once more on the thermal and then dropped. She did not see what it had in its feet. She did not see it at all until the sky delivered its contents onto her arm, with a weight and a cold that she would spend the next 3 months trying to describe and never once get right, because there are no civilian words for the sensation of something living tightening around your forearm in a single second out of a clear blue evening, something dark and longer than you expect, something that does not release and does not release and does not release. The snake was 4.5 feet long. In the moment itself, there was only the tight coil of it and the striking, the open mouth coming at her face over and over, the white interior of it which she would see in her sleep for the next 6 weeks whenever she did manage to sleep, and the screaming, her own screaming, which she did not recognize as her own voice at the time, and then the hawk like something from a different story entirely, something that had been on its way to somewhere else, and had simply stopped by. The wings, she told Wendell later, were the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. Louder than thunder, louder than the tractor, louder somehow than the screaming which was still going. The hawk tried 4 times. It came down on her and the snake together, its talons catching on her forearm alongside the coils, pulling and losing, the snake tightening each time the way a thing tightens when it believes it is about to be taken away. And Marlene's arm was coming up each time because the hawk was so much stronger than she expected, lifting her arm like a prayer flag in a gale. And she felt the talons in her skin, not painful yet the way the deep ones never are at first, and she was aware of blood in a general and specific way simultaneously, the way you are aware of rain when you are already in it. The 4th time it worked. The hawk took the snake and was gone. She ran. She ran toward the sound of Wendell's tractor, toward the front section of the property, and she was not speaking in any language she was aware of. And when she reached him and he turned the engine off and looked at her, she watched his face do the thing that faces do when the information arriving at them is too large and too wrong to be processed in normal order. And he said something she did not hear, and she said, "A snake fell out of the air." And he said something again, and she said, and then the hawk and Wendell, who had been married to her for 45 years and had therefore seen most of what she was capable of, looked at her face, looked at her arm, got off the tractor, and did not say another word except what she wanted, fast or faster. She said faster. He drove the Dodge through town at a speed that she did not know the truck could technically achieve, and she sat in the passenger seat with her arm held across her chest and pressed the hem of her shirt against the places that were open, and she looked out the windshield at the August evening unrolling ahead of them, the pine trees lining the county road, the gas stations, the lot where the church had a sign that said "God sees the sparrow," and she thought, with a hysterical clarity, that God had apparently also seen the hawk. She did not think about Delia in the truck. She did not think about Delia in the emergency room, when they cleaned her arm and gave her the antibiotics and explained about monitoring for swelling, about the specific kind of swelling that meant the venom had reached the bloodstream. She did not think about Delia until later that night, sitting in the hospital room with her arm wrapped in white, and Wendell asleep in the chair beside her with his chin on his chest, and the particular 3 in the morning quiet of a place full of beeping machinery. and it arrived the way things arrive when you have been keeping them at a distance long enough that you exhaust yourself. Simply arrived with her full name attached, Delia Ann Collier, and Marlene sat with it in the fluorescent stillness and understood that she was alive, and that Delia was still dying, and that these two facts existed simultaneously in the same world, and she did not know what to do with that. She did not sleep. On the lens of her glasses, when they examined them the following morning, there was a small residue of liquid that the doctor looked at carefully, and then looked at her and said carefully that there was a possibility that had been a very close thing. Marlene nodded. She already knew. The hospital had released her on a Tuesday, and by Thursday Marlene was back at the kitchen table with her arm propped on a folded dish towel, eating scrambled eggs. She had made too dry because she had been thinking about something other than the eggs, which was becoming a habit she could not seem to break. Wendell had gone to the hardware store. The house was the particular quiet that a house becomes when the person who usually fills it with background sound, a radio left on in another room, the soft percussion of boots on hardwood, the low talking to himself that Wendell did without knowing he did it, has stepped out for 40 minutes, and the quiet is not unpleasant exactly, but it has a texture to it, a slight pressure behind the ears, the way silence feels when you have been living loudly enough for long enough that stillness registers as a kind of absence rather than a condition. Marlene looked at her arm. The bandages were fresh, and beneath them she could feel the particular tightness of skin that is healing in a way it does not entirely enjoy, a low continuous complaint that was not quite pain but was not quite not pain either, and she pressed 2 fingers gently against the edge of the wrapping, and then stopped, because the doctor had said not to do that. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was doing what the yard did in late summer in Hardin County, which was to say it was green in the specific exhausted way of things that have been green through too much heat, a green that had given up being vivid and settled for simply persisting, and the light on it was white and flat at 9 in the morning, and somewhere in the stand of pine at the property's edge a dove was doing the thing doves do in heat, that low repeated note that is technically a call but sounds more like a question with no real hope of an answer. She had been home for 2 days and she had not called Austin. She knew she should call Austin. She had the phone face up on the table beside her plate, which was as far as intention had gotten her so far, and every time her eyes went to it she found a reason to take them somewhere else, to the window, to the eggs, to the middle distance, where nothing in particular was happening and therefore nothing in particular required her attention. Delia would want to know. Delia would want to know about the hawk and the snake the way Delia had always wanted to know the strange, specific, undeniable things that happened in the world, the things that did not fit into any expected category, and therefore proved to Delia that the expected categories were insufficient, that the world was larger and stranger and more personally interested in the people inside it than any reasonable person was prepared to admit on a Tuesday morning. That had always been Delia's position. Marlene had always been the skeptic between them, the one who looked for the wire, the one who needed the rational frame, and Delia had loved her for it the way you love someone whose limitations clarify your own gifts by contrast, had loved her patiently, and with a kind of cheerful certainty that Marlene would eventually come around. And Marlene had spent decades not coming around, and now the phone was face up on the table beside dry scrambled eggs, and Delia was dying in a bed in Austin. And Marlene was the one who had survived a thing that should not have happened to anyone. She thought Delia would find that funny, not cruelly funny. Delia funny, which was the specific, warm, exasperated amusement of someone who has been saying the universe is paying attention and has finally received evidence that is simply too large to ignore. She picked up the phone. She put it down again. She was not ready for Delia's voice, not ready for the new version of it, the one that had changed since March and required concentration to receive correctly, the one that ended every call with Marlene sitting very still for a long time afterward, not crying, but in some state adjacent to crying, some vestibule of it. Instead, she looked at the notepad. The notepad had been on the table since the morning after the hospital, when she had woken at 4:30 and could not locate sleep again, and had come downstairs and made coffee, and sat with the new specific fact of having been closer to death than she had understood at the time, and what had come out of her in the dark was not an organized thought, but a list, items and fragments in no particular order, things she had not done and things she had done, and things she did not know how to undo. The list was not addressed to anyone, but she understood, looking at it now in the thin morning light with the eggs going cold, that it was addressed to Delia, had been addressed to Delia from the first word, because Delia was the person in her life to whom every unresolved thing had always eventually been addressed, the way water finds the lowest point, not because it decides to, but because that is simply what water does. The top item on the list, the first thing she had written at 4:30 in the morning, was a single line in her own handwriting that said, "I have not forgiven myself for not being there." She covered it with her hand. She was not going to read the rest of it now. 3 days after the hospital, the woman from the county extension office came by, because Hardin County is the kind of place where news travels at speeds that have no formal infrastructure, and her name was Frances, and she was 61 years old, and had the particular manner of a person who has survived enough of her own difficulties that she no longer feels the need to manage other people's reactions to theirs, which is to say she came in, accepted coffee, sat down, looked at Marlene's arm without making a face about it, and said, "I heard what happened to you out there." Marlene said yes, Frances said, and I heard something else too, and Marlene waited, and Frances turned her coffee cup in a slow half circle on the table, and then stopped turning it, and said, "That your sister is in a bad way down in Austin." Marlene said yes. Frances was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone choosing between several things they could say and rejecting most of them, and then she said, "There is a woman I know." She said it the way people in Hardin County say, "There is a woman I know," which is a phrase with a great deal of weight underneath it. A phrase that does not mean there happens to be a woman of my acquaintance, but means instead, I know someone who holds a particular kind of knowledge, and I have been considering whether this is the right moment to mention her, and I have decided that it is. Her name is Ruth, Frances said. She does not do what you are probably thinking she does. She helped a family in Woodville last year, when the Beaumont woman passed and the family wanted to be the ones to care for her. She sat with them through the whole of it. She knew what to do with the body, with the paperwork, with the sitting through the night. She knew how to make it a thing the family could hold on to, instead of a thing that was taken from them. Marlene looked at her coffee. She said, "I do not know what Delia wants," Frances said quietly, and without looking away, "Does she know what she wants?" And Marlene felt something shift at the base of her sternum, a small tectonic thing. Something that had been held in a fixed position for so long that it had forgotten it was capable of moving, and she realized that she had been operating for 8 months on the assumption that this was something happening to Delia, rather than something Delia had any agency inside of, and that this assumption was wrong, had perhaps always been wrong, and that the phone face up on the kitchen table had been waiting for a different kind of call than the one she had been practicing. She said, "I need to think about this." Frances said, "Of course you do." She finished her coffee and left, and the dove outside started again, and Marlene looked at the notepad, at the shape of her own hand covering the first line she had written, and she thought about the hawk, about the precise and mechanical efficiency of it, about the way it had done what it came to do, and then was simply gone, no ceremony, no aftermath, no particular interest in what it had left behind. She thought about how she had felt that night in the hospital when the doctor had shown her the lens of her glasses, the residue of liquid on it, the close thing acknowledged. How she had felt was not what people expected when she told them. She had felt, underneath the terror and the shaking and the antiseptic smell of the room, something that she could only describe to herself as a door. A specific interior door she had not known was there, that had opened perhaps 2 or 3 inches and let in a draft from somewhere she could not see. And in that draft was the smell of pine resin and cut grass and something older underneath, something she could not name but recognized. The way you recognize a melody you have not heard since childhood. The way recognition arrives before the memory does. She picked up the phone. She called Austin. When Delia answered, her voice was the new voice, the one that required concentration, and Marlene listened to it with her whole body and said nothing for a moment, just let herself hear it. And then she said, "Delia, I want to ask you something." And Delia said, carefully, and with that patience she had been exercising for 8 months like a muscle, "Go ahead." And Marlene said, "When the time comes, what do you want?" The silence on the line was not an empty one. Then Delia said, "I want to be in my own bed, in the green dress, and I want you to be there, Marlene. I want you to be the one." Outside, the dove had finally stopped. The kitchen was completely still, and the light through the window had shifted while they had not been paying attention, had found its angle and its shadows, and Marlene looked at her bandaged arm resting on the table, and at the notepad beneath her other hand, and she thought that something had just happened that she did not yet have the language for. Something that was not the end of anything, and was not the beginning exactly, but was more like the moment in a long journey when you finally understand which direction you have been going all along. Ruth Calloway lived 12 miles out on a county road that Marlene had driven past 100 times without stopping. And the first time Marlene turned into that driveway, 3 days later, she noticed that every one of the old pecan trees along it was perfectly still, though the cedars at the property's edge were moving. The driveway was made of packed caliche, the white crushed limestone that East Texas uses for its back roads, and it gave off a faint mineral smell in the morning heat, the kind of smell that belongs to things that have been pressed into usefulness over a very long time. And Marlene sat in her truck at the end of it for a moment before she opened the door. The house was not what she had expected. It was a farmhouse of weathered gray cedar, 1 story, with a deep front porch running its full width, and on the porch, 2 rocking chairs that had clearly been sitting in the same positions for many years, and had the posture of furniture that has accepted its permanent assignment, and hanging from the porch ceiling between them, a cluster of dried herbs tied with brown kitchen twine, so old and dry that their original identities had collapsed into a single composite smell, green and bitter and almost medicinal, that reached Marlene before she had fully cleared the cab of the truck. She noticed she was gripping the door handle harder than was necessary. She made herself let go. Ruth Calloway was already on the porch when Marlene got to the steps, standing with one hand on the porch rail in a way that suggested she had been standing there long enough to be comfortable, though Marlene had not seen her come out, and she was somewhere in her mid-70s, with close-cropped white hair, and the particular stillness of a person who has spent a great many years in the deliberate company of things that require quiet. And she looked at Marlene's bandaged arm without any expression of surprise, and said, "Frances called me." Marlene said, "She said you might be able to help." Ruth said, "Come sit down." The rocking chairs were more comfortable than they looked, and Marlene accepted the glass of water on the small table between the chairs that Ruth had apparently put there before she arrived, and she drank and looked out at the property, which was a few acres of mixed pine and sweet gum pressing close on 3 sides, with a kitchen garden along the south fence, that was growing with the specific, disciplined abundance of something that has been tended for a long time by someone who knows what they are doing. Ruth said, "Tell me about your sister. Not tell me what you need. Not tell me what Francis told you. Tell me about your sister." Marlene sat with that for a moment, because it was a different question than she had been preparing to answer, and different in a way that required a different part of her to respond. And she said, "Her name is Delia. She is 62. She was the one who knew things before they happened. She was the one who always said the world was paying more attention than I was willing to give it credit for." Ruth said, "And you?" Marlene said, "I was the one who needed the explanation." Ruth was quiet, looking at the kitchen garden. Then she said, "And now?" Marlene looked at her bandaged arm. She said, "And now I am less certain about explanations." Ruth nodded once, the nod of someone receiving information they already held but needed to hear confirmed, and then she was quiet for a period that should have been uncomfortable and somehow was not, the kind of quiet that has a shape to it, a deliberate architecture. And Marlene found that her grip on the water glass had loosened and her shoulders had dropped approximately an inch from where they had been holding themselves since she had turned into the driveway. Ruth said, "I need to tell you something about what I do, so you understand it correctly before we go any further." Marlene said, "All right." Ruth said, "I am not a funeral director. I hold no license from the state of Texas for that purpose. What I am is a person who has sat with families in this part of the county for 23 years when someone was dying and the family wanted to be the ones to do the caring. Texas law permits families to prepare and care for their own dead. What I do is make sure families understand that right and know how to exercise it. I show them how to bathe and dress the body. I show them the paperwork. I sit with them through the hours that are hardest, which are usually not the ones people expect." She paused. She said, "What I do not do is make it easier by making it faster. I make it slower. I make it more present. And some people find that they cannot bear it, and those people need a different kind of help than I can give. But most families, once they have done it, say the same thing." Marlene said, "What do they say?" Ruth said, "They say they cannot imagine having done it any other way." Marlene felt something at the back of her throat, not tears exactly, more like the precursor to tears, the molecular preparation for something that had not yet decided whether it was going to arrive or not. She swallowed it and said, "Delia told me what she wants. She wants to be in her own bed. She wants me there. She named the dress." Ruth looked at her then, fully, and Marlene had the brief disorienting sensation of being seen with more precision than she was accustomed to, not intrusively, but with the competence of someone who has spent decades reading the specific grammar of grief and can parse in a glance the particular sentence a person is constructing with their posture and their pauses and the way they hold an almost empty water glass. Ruth said, "The dress is important." Marlene said, "Yes," Ruth said, "and you are afraid." Marlene said, "Yes." Then she said, "I do not know how to do this. I have never done anything like this." Ruth said, "Nobody has the first time. That is not the obstacle you think it is." She stood up from the rocking chair and said, "I want to show you something before you go." She took Marlene through the front door into a house that smelled of cedar and old books and something floral she could not immediately identify. Lavender, possibly, or something adjacent to lavender, something dried and stored for a long time in a cool room, and through a hallway with framed photographs of people she did not know, and a small shelf with 3 or 4 objects she did not examine closely, and into a back room that was clearly where Ruth worked. A plain table, 2 straight-back chairs, a set of shelves with labeled cloth bags and glass bottles, arranged with the particular neatness of things that are used regularly and returned to precisely the same position each time. On the table was a cloth folded in a specific way, with great care, and beside it small ceramic bowl. Ruth said, "The bathing is the part that families are most afraid of beforehand. It is also the part that they almost always describe afterward as the thing that changed them. Not frightened them, changed them." Marlene looked at the folded cloth. She thought of Delia's hands. She thought of how Delia's hands had looked in March, in the doorway of that Austin bedroom, thinner than she remembered them being, the tendons more visible, the rings she had worn for 30 years now, sitting in a dish on the bedside table, because they no longer stayed where they were put. She said, "I did not take good care of things." It came out without her deciding to say it. Ruth did not say, "Of course you did," the way most people would have. She did not say, "I am sure that is not true." She said, "What things?" Marlene said, "I did not come back for a very long time. There were reasons. There were always reasons. And then there was the phone call in March, and I came, and it was..." She stopped and started again. "It was too late to be what I should have been earlier." Ruth said, "That is a weight you have been carrying a long time." Marlene said, "Yes," Ruth said, quietly, and without softness, meaning not gently but not harshly. The way you speak a practical truth to someone who is ready to hear a practical truth. The caring you do now is not a correction of what came before. It is not a debt you are paying. It is its own thing, separate and whole. If you carry it in as a debt, it will feel like one, to you and to her. The room was very still. Outside, somewhere in the stand of pine at the back of the property, a woodpecker was working at something with a steady mechanical patience, and the sound of it came through the window without apology, regular and purposeful and indifferent to the conversation in the room, and Marlene found herself listening to it for a moment, the way you listen to something that is simply doing what it is built to do, without ceremony, without hesitation. She thought of the hawk. She thought of how the hawk had not hesitated, had not circled an additional time to reconsider, had simply identified the situation and descended and done what it descended to do, and then was gone, carrying the thing it had come for. She said, "I will come back." Ruth looked at her and said, "I know." Then she walked Marlene back through the hallway, and Marlene glanced at the small shelf as she passed and saw on it, among the other things, a single white feather, very long, standing upright in a narrow glass vase, and she did not stop to look at it, but she noticed it in the way you notice something you will think about later, in the way a detail lodges itself in the peripheral vision and waits there quietly for the moment when the conscious mind is ready to retrieve it. "At the porch," Ruth said, "when it is closer, call me. Not for information, just call. People in this part of a thing need someone who knows where they are." Marlene said, "All right." She drove the 12 miles back on the county road with both hands on the wheel and the windows down because the air conditioning had a smell she had never tracked down, and the pines went by on both sides in their patient repetition. And she thought about what Ruth had said about the bathing, about the part that changes people, and she thought about Delia's green dress, and she thought about the notebook on the kitchen table with its first line, still covered by the impression of her own palm. There was one more thing she noticed before she could let herself stop thinking about that morning at Ruth's house, the white feather in the narrow glass vase on the shelf, and it was not until she was almost asleep that night, with Wendell's breathing going steady beside her, and the pine trees pressing their quiet against the window screen, that she understood what species of feather it had been, and found she could not entirely explain why that knowledge settled in her chest the way it did, not cold and not warm exactly, but present, and too specific to be coincidence, and too large to be anything so small as a sign. The drive to Austin took 4 hours and 20 minutes, and Marlene made it alone. Wendell had offered again at the door, keys already in his hand, and she had looked at him with what she hoped was sufficient clarity and said, "I need to do this particular part by myself." And he had understood, which was one of the things about 45 years with a person, the accumulation of a shared grammar precise enough that certain sentences did not require their full length to be delivered. She left at 6 in the morning, Before the heat had organized itself into its daily intention, the truck moved through Hardin County in the early gray, past the feed store with its hand-painted sign, past the church lot, past the stand of sweet gum where the county road bent south, and the sky opened up briefly before the trees closed it again. And then she was on the highway, and the trees fell back, and the sky above her became very large and very pale. That specific pre-dawn pale of the Texas sky that is not quite any color yet. That is the sky in the state of becoming. And she drove into it with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. She stopped outside of Huntsville for gas and stood beside the truck in the warming air, and she looked at her arm, at the bandages that were now more familiar to her than the skin beneath them. And she pressed the fingers of her other hand briefly against the edge of the wrapping the way she kept doing, despite the doctor's instructions. Not hard, just to confirm that it was still there, that the solid, inconvenient fact of it was still present. And then she went inside and bought a coffee she did not particularly want because standing still beside the truck had started to feel like a thing she could fall into. She thought about Ruth's house. She had been thinking about Ruth's house in the fractured way you think about something that has gotten into your system without your full permission, in pieces and at odd angles. The smell of those dried herbs on the porch coming back to her at random moments, opening the refrigerator, sitting in the shower, standing in the dark kitchen at 4 a.m, with the notepad open and the pen in her hand, and she had not been able to locate the specific memory with enough steadiness to examine it directly, which meant it was doing something in her that required the indirect approach. What Ruth had said about the caring, not a debt, its own thing, separate and whole. She had been turning that over for 3 days, and it had not yet settled into anything she could call a conclusion, but it had changed the quality of the turning, which was different from the grinding she had been doing before. The 8 months of grinding that had worn a groove she kept returning to. The groove that went, "You should have come sooner. You should have called more. You let the distance become a habit, and the habit become a fact, and the fact become a wall. And then the wall became 8 months that you cannot reclaim no matter how fast Wendell drives the truck." The groove was still there, but something was growing alongside it now, something without a name yet, something that had to do with a white feather in a narrow glass vase and a woman in her mid-70s who said, "The caring you do now is its own thing." And Marlene could not yet hold these two things in the same hand, but she was learning the shape of both. She got back in the truck. She drove. There was a particular moment on the highway, past the last of the dense timber and into the more open country before the hill country proper began, where the sky became very wide and very blue, and the road ahead was visible for what felt like several miles of its own future. And she was in that section of highway when it arrived, the thing she had not been expecting, which was not tears, which she had been expecting and had prepared for, but a memory, a specific and uninvited memory that presented itself with the completeness and sensory accuracy of something that had been stored at a temperature perfectly calibrated for preservation. She was 11 years old. Delia was 13. They were in the back field of their parents' property, the one that backed up to the creek, and it was late in an August afternoon much like this one, and Delia had found a bird. The bird was a juvenile red-tailed hawk, though they did not know that then, knew only that it was a hawk of some kind, brown and white and ungainly in the grass. One wing held at an angle that was wrong in a way that was immediately and viscerally apparent even to children who knew nothing about birds, and it was looking at them with the specific expression of a creature that has not yet decided whether the things in front of it are threats or not. Delia had said, "We have to help it." Marlene had said, "How?" Delia had said, "I do not know yet, but we have to." They had spent 2 hours with that bird, The two of them crouched in the late August grass, and they had not ultimately helped it in any way that a biologist would validate, had not set the wing, had not called anyone with the appropriate expertise, had done nothing but stay. The two of them in the grass with the hawk between them, keeping still, keeping present, until the light went and their mother called them in, and the next morning the hawk was gone, and Delia had said, "See," and Marlene had said, "We did not do anything," and Delia had said, "We stayed." Marlene sat in the moving truck with this memory and felt it take up its full room in her chest. She had spent 30 years in the unspoken position that staying was insufficient, that presence without expertise, without competence, without the correct tools and the correct knowledge, was a form of helplessness that she would not dignify by calling it help. And she understood now, in the open country between Huntsville and Austin with the sky very blue above her, that this position had cost her more than she had ever calculated, had cost her specifically the 17 years of moderate distance from her sister that had calcified into the 8 months she could not recover, and that the position had been wrong from the beginning, had been wrong in the back field with the hawk in the grass, and wrong in every iteration since. "We stayed," Delia had said. She had been saying it in different forms their entire lives. Sandra met her at the entrance with the manner Marlene now associated with her, that particular practiced equilibrium, and she said, "She is awake and she knows you are coming." And she had a good morning so far, and then she said, "I will let you go in," and stepped aside, and that was all. The hallway of Delia's house smelled of the same things it had always smelled of. The particular combination of old wood floors and whatever candle Delia had been burning for 20 years, something cedar adjacent, something that reminded Marlene of a store in a town they had both grown up near, a hardware store that had also sold candles for reasons no one had ever explained. And standing in that hallway with its familiar smell, Marlene felt the specific grief of the familiar in a new context, the grief of things that have remained themselves while everything around them has changed. The bedroom door was open. Delia was in the bed, propped against pillows, and she was wearing a blue cardigan that Marlene did not recognize, which meant it had been acquired in the past year, in the year that Marlene had not been present for. And her hair was shorter than it had been in March, and her face was the same face, was the face Marlene had known since before she had any other frame of reference for what a face was the face she had spent 62 years reading the way you read a text you know so well that you understand it in your peripheral vision, and it was also different in a way that had no name, not thinner exactly, not more tired exactly, but present in a different register. The way a room is different when someone has opened a window that has not been opened in a long time and the air inside has changed. Delia said, "You look terrible." Marlene said, "You look wonderful." Delia said, "Liar." Marlene sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair that had clearly been positioned there permanently, and she looked at her sister and her sister looked at her, and they held that for a moment, the full weight of it, the 62 years of it, and the 8 months of it, and the 4 hours and 20 minutes of highway between them now dissolved. Delia said, "Show me your arm." Marlene extended it. Delia looked at the bandaging with the expression of someone assessing something carefully, and then she said, "The hawk was looking out for you." Marlene said, "I don't." She stopped, corrected herself. "I cannot say that with any certainty." Delia said, "No, but I can." She reached out and put her hand over Marlene's wrapped forearm, very lightly, the gesture of someone who knows what territory they are touching and is being careful with it, and Marlene felt beneath that light pressure something she had no category for, something that moved through the bandaging and the healing skin and the complicated 8 months between them, and landed somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. She said, "Delia." Delia said, "I know." She said, "I found someone, a woman named Ruth, out in the county." Delia was quiet, listening. Marlene said she explained what it looks like, what you wanted. To be at home. She knows the process. She knows the paperwork and the physical part. She has done it with other families, Delia said, and you can do it. Marlene said, I do not know if I can do it. Ruth said no one knows beforehand. She said that is not the obstacle I think it is. Delia looked at her for a long moment with an expression Marlene recognized from childhood, from 100 moments in which Delia had arrived at a conclusion before Marlene had finished the sentence, and she said, I like Ruth already. Then she said, the green dress is in the closet, left side, in the garment bag. I want you to have seen it before. Marlene stood up. She crossed to the closet, and the green dress was there exactly where Delia had said, in a clear garment bag, and it was a deep forest green with a simple cut. A dress for someone who understood that simplicity is its own statement. And Marlene stood looking at it, with one hand on the closet door, and felt the full specific weight of her sister having chosen this, having looked at her wardrobe and thought about what she wanted to be wearing for the thing that was coming, and selected this dress with the same considered attention she had given to every decision of her life. And the grief of it was not the grief of loss, not exactly, but the grief of clarity, the grief of something being made so real and so chosen and so irrevocably itself that there was no longer any available interpretation except the true one. Her jaw ached. She had been clenching it without knowing. She turned back to the room. Delia was watching her from the pillows, and her expression was not the expression of someone who needs to be managed or protected. It was the expression of someone who has made her peace with a true thing, and is now watching someone she loves make the same crossing, and is patient enough to wait. Marlene said, it is the right dress. Delia said, I know it is. I have known it for years. They talked for 3 hours. Which was longer than Sandra had suggested, and which Sandra accommodated without comment, because she understood, as people in her position understand, that certain conversations have their own requirements, and those requirements take precedence over schedules. They talked about the hardware store and its candles, because Marlene mentioned the smell of the hallway, and they talked about their mother's hands, which had been the hands both of them had inherited in different proportions. And they talked about a summer when they were young that neither of them had mentioned to anyone in decades. A summer on a lake that no longer existed as it had existed then, and they talked about things that were not finished and things that were. And Marlene did not uncover the first line of the notepad in this conversation, but she said the thing it contained, said it in different words, said it to Delia's face in the afternoon light of the Austin bedroom, and Delia listened to the whole of it without interrupting, which was not Delia's natural tendency and was therefore a gift of the first order. Then Delia said, the distance was not all your doing, Marlene. I let it be what it became too. We both built the wall. You do not get to own the whole of it. Marlene looked at the window. The live oak outside it was very old and very certain of itself. Its branches extended in all directions with the confidence of something that has had decades to determine the precise angle it wants to occupy in relation to the sky. And the afternoon light came through it in the broken, specific way that light comes through old trees, finding the gaps and using them. And she sat in one of those traveling pieces of light, and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, I will be here. At the end, I will be the one, Delia said. I know you will. When Marlene left 2 hours later, Sandra walked her to the door, and at the door Sandra said, in her precise and balanced way, it will probably be within the month, and Marlene nodded. And Sandra said, she talks about you, and Marlene said, what does she say? And Sandra looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood, and said, she says you were always the sensible one, and that she spent 60 years being grateful you were wrong about that. Marlene drove home in the dark. The highway was a different thing at night. The trees invisible beyond the reach of the headlights. The sky above the road very deep and very full of stars in the way the Texas sky is full of stars when you are far enough from any city's argument with the dark, and she drove through it with the windows up this time and the radio still off. And she thought about the green dress in the garment bag, and about Ruth's calm hands on the edge of the porch rail, and about a white feather standing upright in a narrow glass vase, and about the hawk descending without hesitation out of a clear evening sky. And she thought that she did not understand what any of these things meant yet, but that she was beginning to understand that they were connected, that they were speaking in a register she had spent 62 years without the vocabulary for, and was now, in the last available moment, learning to hear. The stars were out in full over Hardin County when she turned on to the county road toward home, and somewhere in the pine dark to the left of the highway, down the long straight corridor of Bragg Road where the old rail line used to run, a light moved slowly through the trees, bobbing once, retreating, and then going quietly out, and she saw it from the corner of her eye and did not, for the first time in her life, look away. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after Austin. Marlene was in the garden, which was not something she had been in the habit of doing before this summer, but had become, in the weeks since the hospital, a way of being outside without being in the yard having acquired a quality she was still negotiating with, a weight in the air above it that had nothing to do with humidity and everything to do with memory. So the garden on the east side of the house had become where she went when she needed to be somewhere with her hands occupied and her eyes at ground level, and she was pressing a loose border stone back into its bed of soil when the phone went off in her shirt pocket. She looked at the screen. Sandra. She sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and answered it. Sandra said what she said in the register she used for this specific information. The clinical flat of it, not cold but precise. Stripped of anything that would require Marlene to manage Sandra's feelings in the same moment she was receiving the news. And what she said was that Delia had had a difficult night, that the morning had shown a change in her breathing, that the hospice nurse had been by and had used the words active transition, and that if Marlene was coming, she should come now. Marlene said, "I am already in the truck." She was not yet in the truck. She stood up from the garden and went inside and washed the soil from her hands at the kitchen sink, and she watched her hands under the running water with the detached attention of someone observing a procedure, the brown water going clear and then gone. And she turned off the tap and dried her hands on the dish towel and picked up her already packed bag from the bottom of the stairs where it had been sitting for 11 days. And she called Ruth. Ruth answered on the second ring. Marlene said, "It is time." Ruth said, "I will meet you there. Text me the address. Drive carefully," that was all. Wendell was at the door before she reached it. Because Wendell had a quality she had never found a satisfactory word for, a kind of atmospheric awareness of the significant moment. And he held the door and then held her for a count of 3 breaths, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, motor oil and the specific soap he had used for 30 years. And then she stepped back and he said, "Call me when you get there." And she said, "I will." And she meant it entirely. The drive was the same highway, the same trees and the same sky, but experienced at a different frequency than the first time, the way the same piece of music heard under different conditions becomes technically the same notes, and functionally a different experience entirely, and she drove it in a state she could only describe as clear, which surprised her because she had expected something more turbulent, had prepared herself over the 17 days for a specific quality of interior weather that had not arrived, had brought instead this strange pellucid calm, a clarity that had nothing peaceful about it but was not painful either, was simply the state of a person moving without obstruction toward the thing they have been moving toward all along. She thought about what Ruth had said on the porch the first visit. I make it slower. I make it more present. She thought she understood that now, in a way she had not understood it then, which was that presence was not the same as comfort, that being fully inside a thing was not the same as being protected from it, but that there was a kind of solidity on the other side of that distinction that protection never provided, a solidity that came specifically from not having turned away. She had spent a great deal of her life turning away at moderate angles, not dramatically, not in the way of someone who has broken with their life and rebuilt it elsewhere, in the way of someone who develops, gradually and without formal decision, a collection of small avoidances that accumulate over decades into a considerable distance from the things that matter most. And then one July evening a hawk falls out of a clear sky and takes with it the snake, and also in the same motion the last of the available excuses. Ruth's car was already in the driveway. Marlene had not expected that and felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of it. The familiar gray sedan sitting now in this Austin street with its patient competence. And she thought that Ruth had driven 4 hours and arrived before her, and that this was the kind of fact that reordered other facts around it, without announcing that it was doing so. She got out of the truck. Sandra opened the door before she knocked and said, "She is resting, and she has been saying your name since about 9 this morning. And Ruth is in with her." And Marlene said, "Thank you, Sandra," and meant it in the specific register that means more than the words. And Sandra received it in that register and nodded and stepped aside. The hallway with its familiar smell. The bedroom door opened the same way it had been opened 6 weeks ago. And the afternoon light through the live oak broken and moving the same way. And the green dress no longer in the closet. She understood this before she saw it, understood it in the body before her eyes confirmed it. The green dress laid out across the chair in the corner with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of statement. The dress present and waiting, and already committed to its purpose. Ruth was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She looked up when Marlene came in, and her expression said several things simultaneously without words. Said, "She has been waiting for you." And "The time is what it is," and "You are here," which is the only thing that is required of you at this moment. Marlene went to the other side of the bed. Delia's breathing had a quality she had not heard before, a spacing and a depth to it that was not labored but was deliberate in a way that healthy breathing is not deliberate, a breathing that was working at something. And her eyes were partly open but focused in the middle distance, not at Marlene or Ruth or the room, and her hands were open on the coverlet, palms up, the way people hold their hands when they have put something down and are not planning to pick it up again. Marlene sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up Delia's hand. It was lighter than she expected, not thinner, just lighter, the way something is lighter when its relationship to the ground has begun to change. And she held it in both of hers and sat very still. And Ruth sat very still on the other side, and the live oak outside moved in a breath of wind that Marlene could not hear but could see in the traveling light across the floor. And the room was the most present room she had ever been in, was so present it had a weight and a texture, was so present that her own body felt it as a kind of pressure, not unpleasant, not frightening, the pressure of being inside something real with her complete and undivided attention. She said, "Delia." Delia's hand moved, the lightest possible movement, the pressure of a recognition. She said, "I am here." I stayed. For a moment she would not be able to say afterward how long the moment was, whether seconds or something longer, that simply did not feel longer. Delia's breathing paused in a way that was different from the pauses that had been coming before it, and then resumed, quieter, and then was quiet again, and then was not breathing, And Marlene understood this not because she had any clinical reference for it, but because the room understood it and told her the way a room tells you when the quality of what it contains has fundamentally changed. She did not move. She held her sister's hand and did not move, and Ruth, across the bed, was completely still, and the live oak outside continued its slow motion in the invisible wind, and the traveling pieces of light continued their patient crossing of the floor, and Marlene sat inside the most complete silence she had ever inhabited, and did not look away from any of it, did not turn at any angle, did not find a wire or require an explanation, just sat with the full and irrevocable and strangely luminous fact of it, and stayed. In the stillness that followed, she became aware of a smell she could not account for. Not the cedar candle, not the room's own familiar breath, something older and greener, something that had no business being present in an Austin house in the last of the afternoon. A smell like cut grass and pine resin and the particular mineral coolness of caliche after rain, the smell of Hardin County, the smell of home. The hours after were not what Marlene had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for something that would require endurance in the athletic sense, the gritting and the getting through, the white-knuckled passage from one side of an experience to the other, and what arrived instead was something that required a completely different set of capacities, something slower and more specific, and in certain moments so unexpectedly tender that she had to keep revising her understanding of what she was inside of. Ruth had brought a bag. She had brought it in from her car without announcing that she had brought it, had simply set it on the floor by the door at some point during the first hour, and when the time came she opened it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone unpacking tools for a job they know thoroughly and respect completely. And what came out of it was a folded cloth, a ceramic bowl, several small glass bottles with cloth-wrap stoppers, and a bar of unscented soap, and she set these on the dresser in a specific order that was clearly not arbitrary. Ruth said, "We have time." She said it the way she said most things, without softness and without hardness, the way you state a practical fact to someone who needs a practical fact more than they need comfort. And what she meant was that the hours before the body required attention from outside the room were sufficient hours for the people in the room to simply be in the room, and that this was not wasted time, was in fact the most important time, and that she had seen families skip past it in their urge to do something, and regret the skipping for years afterward. Marlene did not skip past it. She sat with Delia's hand in hers for a long time, and the light through the live oak continued its traveling. And at some point the light changed quality, and she understood that the afternoon was becoming evening, without having tracked the transition, and she was aware of Ruth moving quietly in the background, and she was aware of Sandra bringing tea she did not drink, and she was aware of her own breathing, which had settled into something steadier than it had been on the highway, steadier than it had been in the truck outside, steadier than she could remember it being in 8 months. She thought of the notepad. She thought of the first line, still covered by the impression of her hand, and she understood that she had been covering it because she had been afraid of it, and that the covering of it had been a way of maintaining the wound in its original condition, preserving the specific injury of it against the possibility of healing, which was a thing people did, she understood now, not out of self-destruction, but out of a confused loyalty to the grief, as though the wound was the last connection, and healing it was a form of abandonment. She was not going to cover it anymore. Ruth came to stand beside her, not intrusively, and said, "Whenever you are ready." Marlene said, "Tell me what to do." Ruth said, "First, I am going to tell you why we do each thing. Not so you understand it academically, so you understand it while your hands are doing it. Because the understanding and the doing need to be together, or the doing is just procedure, and it deserves to be more than procedure. Marlene said. "All right." Ruth sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Delia with the expression Marlene was coming to recognize as Ruth's specific form of respect, which was not reverence in the performed sense, but attention in the genuine one, full and unhurried attention, and she said, "Bathing the body is the oldest thing a family can do for someone they have lost. It is older than any institution, older than any industry built around death. It is what people did before anyone told them they needed someone else to do it for them. It is not clinical. It is not morbid. It is the last physical act of care, and it is complete in itself." She paused. She said, "What you will notice when you begin is that your hands will know more than you expect them to. People always say this afterward. They say they did not know how to do it, and then they did it, and their hands knew. I do not have a satisfying explanation for that. I have only seen it be true many times, with many different people in many different rooms." The water was warm in the ceramic bowl, and the first touch of the cloth on Delia's hand was, she had no preparation for what it was, had no category for it, felt her own hand stop its motion for a single second and then continue. And then it was simply motion, simple and rhythmic and present. And she understood what Ruth had said about the hands knowing. Not because there was anything mystical in the knowing, but because the body carries a memory of care that the conscious mind does not have sole custody of, and her hands moved through that memory with a steadiness that surprised her, and that she did not question. She talked. She said, "You were right about the world paying attention. She said, you were right about a great many things, and I am sorry it took me this long to be a big enough person to say so without a qualifier attached. She said, the dress is exactly right. You always had better instincts about these things than I did." When it was done, Marlene sat back in the chair. She was aware of her body in the specific way you are aware of your body after physical work that has also been emotional work, the combination of exertions that leaves a person not exhausted in the collapsing sense, but emptied in the clean sense, the way a room is emptied when it has been properly cleaned and is now ready to be something else. Ruth said, from the other side of the room, "You did that well." Marlene said, "I did not know if I could." Ruth said, "You did not need to know. You needed to show up." Ruth said, "I want to ask you something, and you do not have to answer tonight. But I want you to sit with it." Marlene said, "All right." Ruth said, "In 23 years of this work, I have seen two kinds of people come out the other side of a room like this one. The first kind comes out and spends the rest of their life trying to get back to before it, trying to return to the self they were before they knew this particular thing. And I understand that impulse. I do not judge it. But it does not work, and the trying costs them." She paused. She said, "The second kind comes out and understands that they have been given something, not instead of the loss, not in compensation for it, alongside it. A knowledge that changes the quality of everything they look at afterward. Not the content of their lives, but the resolution of it, the granularity. Everything becomes more specific, more itself, more worth the full attention." Marlene looked at her sister in the green dress. She said, "And you are asking which kind I will be." Ruth said, "I am not asking that. I know which kind you will be. I am asking you to be deliberate about it, to choose it consciously, rather than arrive at it by accident. Because the ones who arrive at it by accident sometimes do not recognize it when they get there, and they spend years not recognizing it, and that is a waste of a very specific kind of understanding that not everyone is given." The room was almost dark now. Ruth said, "There is one more thing." She crossed to the dresser, and from her bag she took something small, wrapped in a square of gray cloth, and she held it out to Marlene, and Marlene unwrapped it and found in her palm a single river stone, dark gray, smooth, the size of a large coin, with a weight that was slightly more than its size suggested, the satisfying specific weight of something that has been held for a very long time by moving water, and has been made exactly what it is by that long holding. Ruth said. "You carry that until you are ready to put it down. When you are ready to put it down, you will know where it goes." Marlene closed her hand around it. It was cool against her palm, and then it was warm. She looked at Ruth across the lamplit room and said, "Why did you come? You drove 4 hours. You did not know Delia." Ruth said, "I knew you." She said it simply, without elaboration, the way you say a thing that does not require elaboration. And then she began to pack her bag with the same quiet efficiency with which she had unpacked it. Each item returned to its place, the bowl and the cloth and the small glass bottles. And when the bag was packed, she set it by the door and came back and stood beside Marlene's chair and put one hand briefly on Marlene's shoulder. And that was all. And it was sufficient. Marlene stayed with Delia until midnight, and when she finally left, the river stone in her jacket pocket and Ruth's car already gone from the driveway, she stood on the sidewalk under the live oak for a long moment and looked up through its branches at the stars appearing between its leaves, and she had the distinct and unguarded sensation that something above the canopy was looking back, not threatening, not benign exactly, but present and interested and patient in the way that things are patient when they have always known how the story goes. She drove home in the early hours of Thursday morning, arriving in Hardin County as the sky was doing its first pale preparation for dawn, that hour when darkness has not yet conceded but has begun the negotiation, and she pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck and watched the negotiation proceed for a few minutes before she went inside. Wendell was asleep. She had texted him from Austin, and he had texted back a single word, which was home, which was his way of saying come home, which was his way of saying I am here, which was all of those things simultaneously, and none of them required elaboration. And she had held the phone against her chest for a moment after reading it. She went inside and did not turn on any lights. The kitchen in the dark was the kitchen she knew by feel and position, the table's edge at the expected height, the chairs in their expected places, and she found the notepad on the table by touch and sat down in the dark and did not open it, but sat with her hand flat on the cover of it, not pressing, not covering the first line specifically, just present, her palm against the paper. And she sat there for a long time while the sky outside the kitchen window made its slow and irrevocable case for morning. She did not cry. She had expected to cry, had been bracing for it in the way you brace for a wave you can see coming, and what arrived instead was something different. Not grief's acute form, but its chronic one. Not the wave, but the changed quality of the water itself. The understanding that she was now a person who had done the thing she had done, who had been in the room and held the hand and stayed, and that this was permanent, was sewn into her now, and that the permanence of it was not a wound, but was instead the opposite of a wound, was the thing that wounds, when they close correctly, leave behind. The river stone was still in her jacket pocket. She took it out and set it on the table beside the notepad and looked at it in the growing gray light, at its specific dark smoothness, at the way it sat on the table with the self-contained certainty of something that knows exactly what it is. And she thought about what Ruth had said, that she would know where it went when she was ready to put it down. And she did not know yet, but she understood that the not knowing was part of the process, and not a failure of it. She slept for 4 hours on the couch without deciding to sleep, the specific sudden sleep of a body that has spent all of its available currency and requires immediate resupply. And she woke to the sound of Wendell in the kitchen, the coffee maker, the specific sequence of his morning sounds. And she lay still for a moment and took inventory of herself the way you take inventory after something large, noting what was present and what had changed and what was simply gone. What was gone was the grinding. The groove, the 8 months of circular and self-consuming return to the same set of accusations against herself, was quiet in a way it had not been quiet since March. Not silent, not healed entirely, but quiet. The way machinery goes quiet when it has finally been given the thing it was running to produce. And she lay on the couch in the morning light and noticed the quiet, and did not fill it with anything. Wendell brought her coffee without being asked. He sat on the edge of the coffee table across from her and held his own cup and looked at her face, doing the reading he had been doing for 45 years, and then he said, "Ruth called." Marlene said, "When?" He said, "This morning. Early. She said you did well and that she wanted you to know that what you did for your sister was a complete thing. She said you would understand what she meant by complete." Marlene sat up. She held the coffee in both hands, the heat of it traveling through her palms in the specific comforting way of hot things held in the morning, and she said, "I do understand what she means." Wendell said, "I am glad." He did not ask her to explain it, and she did not explain it. And the morning moved through the kitchen windows in its patient progression, the light finding its angles, the yard going from gray to green to the particular exhausted summer green she had been watching for weeks, and she sat inside it and let it be what it was. She went back to Ruth's house the following week. She had not called ahead, which was something she would normally consider a significant social transgression, and the fact that she simply got in the truck one afternoon and drove the 12 miles without announcing herself told her something about what Ruth's house had become in her interior landscape, which was apparently a place outside the normal courtesies, a place that operated by different protocols, a place she could arrive at simply because she needed to be there. Ruth was in the kitchen garden. She came up from the garden after 20 minutes, brushing her hands on the sides of her jeans, and sat in the other rocking chair. And they sat together for a while in the sound of the afternoon, the cicadas in the pine having their relentless conversation, a single crow working the far edge of the property with loud and methodical intent, the particular combined sound of an East Texas summer afternoon that is so present and so continuous that it eventually stops being sound and becomes weather. Ruth said, "How are you sleeping?" Marlene said, "Better than I have in 8 months." Ruth said, "That is correct." She said it the way she said things, without softness, not as a compliment but as a confirmation, the way you confirm a reading on an instrument that has been giving uncertain results and has now returned to its correct calibration. Marlene said, "I want to ask you something." Ruth said, "Ask." Marlene said, "Why is it better? The sleeping, I expected worse. I expected the images, the room, she paused. I expected the hard version. And instead there is this quiet I do not know what to do with." Ruth rocked once, slowly. She said, "What you experienced in that room was complete. You did not leave anything undone. You did not turn away from any part of it. When an experience is complete in that way, the mind does not need to return to it at night to finish what it left unfinished. The nightmares come from the incomplete, from the doors left open, from the things we fled before they were done with us." Marlene said, "And I did not flee." Ruth said, "No, you did not." The crow at the far edge of the property said something loud and final and departed. Marlene reached into her jacket pocket and took out the river stone and held it in her open palm. And Ruth looked at it and then looked at Marlene's face, and Marlene said, "I think I know where it goes." Ruth said, "Tell me." Marlene said, "There is a road, Old Bragg Road, out through the thicket. I have driven past it my entire life, and I have never turned down it. Wendell has. He went down it once as a teenager and said it was the straightest road he had ever been on, and the most uncomfortable he had ever felt, and he has not been back." Ruth was quiet. Marlene said, "The night I drove home from Austin the first time, when I visited Delia and looked at the green dress, I saw something on that road from the highway, a light moving through the trees, and I did not look away." Ruth said, "The Bragg light." She said it without inflection, the way you name a thing you have known about for a long time and have your own relationship to, and Marlene said, "You know about it." And Ruth said, "Everyone who has lived in this county long enough knows about it. Marlene said, "What do you think it is?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think the land in the thicket has absorbed a great deal of human experience over a very long time. I think there are places where that absorption reaches a saturation point and something of what was absorbed becomes legible to people who are in the right condition to read it," Marlene said. "And what condition is that?" Ruth said, "The condition of having recently crossed a threshold of some kind, of having been present for something that most people avoid, of having the particular quality of attention that comes from not having looked away." The cicadas continued their conversation. Marlene looked at the river stone in her palm. She said, "I want to go to the road at night. I want to go before I feel ready, which you have told me is the correct timing. And I want to take the stone." Ruth said yes, just yes. No elaboration, no qualification, no cautionary note. Just the simple confirmation of someone who has heard a correct statement and sees no reason to complicate it. Marlene said, "Will you come with me?" Ruth looked at her with the expression that Marlene was learning to read, the full and unhurried attention, and she said, "No, this part is yours." She said it without apology and without hesitation. And Marlene sat with it and found that she was not afraid of it. Found that the idea of going alone to the straight dark road through the thicket with the river stone in her pocket felt not frightening but correct. The way a destination feels correct when you understand that you have been traveling toward it the entire time. She said, "When?" Ruth said, "You already know when?" Marlene said, "Tonight." Ruth said yes. That evening at 9:47, she turned the truck off the highway and onto the old dirt road. The tree canopy closed over her immediately, the headlights pressing against the dark between the trunks, the road ahead absolutely straight. Straight in the way that roads laid out by rail surveys are straight, with the rigid geometry of something that was never intended to accommodate the curves of the natural world, but only to get from one fixed point to another by the most efficient path. And she drove slowly, the tires quiet on the packed dirt, the windows down, the smell of the thicket coming in, the deep green, dark, damp smell of it, the smell of things decomposing into other things, of the long, patient recycling that the forest conducts without ceasing. She drove for a mile and stopped. She turned the engine off. The dark was complete, the canopy too dense for stars, and the silence that came in through the open windows was not the absence of sound, but a specific and inhabited silence, the silence of a place that has been listening for a very long time and is still listening, and she sat in it with both hands in her lap and the river stone in her jacket pocket, and did not reach for her phone or the radio or any other instrument of distraction. She waited. She did not know what she was waiting for, and did not need to know, which was itself a development she registered quietly. The not needing to know, the willingness to be inside the waiting without demanding that the waiting justify itself in advance. 3 minutes, perhaps 4. It appeared at the far reach of where her eyes could function in the dark. A light, the size described in every account she had ever half heard and dismissed. Approximately the size of a basketball, bluish-white and sharply defined, not flickering, not the vague and gaseous thing she had always assumed the legend meant, but specific, a specific and self-contained light, moving slowly along the road toward her, and then stopping and then moving again, and she watched it with her hands still in her lap, and her jaw unclenched and her breathing steady, and she felt her hand move to the door handle without her deciding to move it, felt herself stepping out of the truck and onto the dirt road without having made the choice to step out, and she stood in the dark with the thicket pressing close on both sides, and the light at a distance she could not accurately measure, and she did not get back in the truck. She took the river stone from her pocket. It was warm, warmer than her body heat could account for. She held it up in the dark, just held it up, open palm, and the light moved once, a slow lateral drift that had no wind to explain it, and then held. She said, out loud, into the dark between the trees, The specific smell of Hardin County coming from all directions now. Pine and cut grass and the mineral coolness of caliche after rain, she said. I stayed. The light bobbed once gently the way a lantern bobs in the hand of someone who has stopped walking but has not stopped breathing, and then it began slowly to recede. She stood on the dirt road and watched it go until it was gone. Then she knelt on the packed caliche and pressed the river stone into the earth at the road's edge, pressed it down until it was flush with the surface, until it was simply part of the road's edge, indistinguishable from the other stones, except that she knew where it was. And she stayed in that position for a moment with her palm flat on the ground, on the dark and patient and deeply listening ground of the big thicket, and felt beneath her palm the faintest possible vibration, which could have been anything, which could have been nothing, which she chose to receive as what it felt like, which was acknowledgement. She stood up. She got back in the truck. She drove home. And the road behind her, in her rearview mirror, was completely dark and completely still. And the trees on both sides of it were absolutely motionless, though she could feel, through the open window, that a wind had been blowing the entire time she had been there. She woke the next morning to the specific quality of light that follows a night of genuine sleep, the kind of sleep that is not a retreat from something, but a return to something. And she lay in it for a moment before she moved, taking its measure, noting the absence of the grinding, noting the further absence of the particular tightness behind her sternum that had been her constant interior companion since March, and that she had stopped noticing in the way you stop noticing a sound that has been continuous long enough to become part of the background of your life. It was gone. Not the grief which was present and would be present for a long time, which she had no interest in rushing or managing out of existence, but the grinding, the self-consuming circular motion of unresolved accusation, the groove worn into the floor of her, the groove that had gone. You should have come sooner. You should have called more. You let the distance become a habit. Gone. She lay in the morning light and sat with the goneness of it, and felt something she could only describe as spacious, a quality of interior space where the grinding had been, not empty but open, the way a room is open when furniture that has been in it too long is finally moved and the floor beneath it, undamaged and still true, is revealed. She got up. She went downstairs and poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table. And the notepad was still there, had been there every morning for months. And she opened it. She read the first line. I have not forgiven myself for not being there. She sat with it. It was still true in the way that past things are true. In the historical sense, the way a scar is true. The record of something that happened and cannot be made not to have happened, but it was no longer operational, was no longer running, was a statement about a person who had existed before Bragg Road, and before the green dress, and before Ruth's house, and before the hawk fell out of a clear July sky, and she picked up the pen and drew a single line through it, slow and deliberate, not hard, not erasure, just the mark of completion. And then she closed the notepad and set it aside and drank her coffee. Wendell came in from the other room and looked at her face and said, "You slept." She said, "I did." He said, "Good." He sat down across from her, and they had breakfast together, and this morning she was entirely in the kitchen, entirely in the specific ordinariness of scrambled eggs made correctly this time, with butter and low heat and patience and toast and the coffee going warm rather than cold, and Wendell reading something to her from his phone about a road construction project on the county road that was going to complicate their route to the hardware store, and she listened to all of it with the full attention she had available, which was more than usual, and found that the full attention made the ordinary things more themselves, made them more specifically what they were, the eggs more egg-like, the coffee more coffee-like, Wendell's voice more exactly the voice it had been for 45 years, and more worth hearing for that exactness. She went back to Ruth's house 3 days later. Ruth was on the porch. Of course Ruth was on the porch. She was in her rocking chair with a cup of something, and the dried herbs above her had been replaced since the first visit, were a fresh cluster now, darker green, still identifiable, and the smell of them was sharper than the old ones had been, more immediate, less collapsed into itself. And Marlene went up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, and Ruth handed her a cup of strong black tea, and they sat in the tea and the morning and the sound of the wind in the pecans for a while without speaking. Ruth said, "How was the road?" Marlene said it was what it needed to be. Ruth said, "Yes," she said, "and the stone." Marlene said, "I left it at the road's edge, pressed into the ground." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is correct." The way she said correct when something was done rightly, which was not the correctness of following a rule, but the correctness of something fitting exactly into its necessary position, the way a key fits a lock it was made for, and Marlene heard it and felt it land in the open space where the grinding had been, felt it settle there with the specific weight of a thing that is true. 6 weeks after Austin, Marlene signed up for the home funeral certification program in Beaumont. The woman who ran it was named Carolyn, and she was 54 years old, and had the manner of someone who had spent a long career in emergency medicine and had arrived through a route she described in the first session as both logical and completely unexpected, at the conclusion that the most important medical event in a person's life was the one that the medical system was least equipped to handle well. And she ran the program with a directness and a humor that Marlene had not expected, and that made the material manageable in a way it might not have been otherwise. There were 6 people in the cohort: a retired pastor from Orange County named Gerald, who spoke slowly and with great care; a woman named Patricia from Lumberton, who was 38 years old and had lost a child and did not talk about it, but whose presence in the room was shaped entirely by it, the way a landscape is shaped by water that is no longer there. 3 others whose stories she learned gradually and held carefully, and herself. She drove to Beaumont on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 40 minutes each way, through the pine country and the small towns with their gas stations and their feed stores and their particular quality of morning. The light still low and amber in the pines, the air still carrying the night's cooler breath, and she drove with the radio off because she had stopped needing the radio to fill the truck the way she had been filling it before, had stopped needing the noise as a management tool for the interior weather, because the interior weather had changed. She took notes. She had not taken notes since a continuing education course in 2014 on property tax assessment, and the notes she took now were different from those notes in every way, were not the efficient shorthand of someone capturing information for later retrieval, but the slower and more deliberate writing of someone for whom the act of writing was itself part of the understanding. She wrote about Delia, not in the notes for the program, but in a separate notebook, a plain gray one she had found at the drugstore, and she wrote in it in the evenings after dinner, when Wendell was watching something in the other room, and the house had its evening quality of settled warmth, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. She wrote about the summer with the hawk in the back field, wrote it in full for the first time, the tall August grass and Delia on her knees with her hands out and the bird between them, holding still, just holding still, and she wrote the sentence Delia had said. We stayed and sat with it for a long time after she wrote it. She wrote about the green dress. She wrote about the smell of Hardin County arriving in a room in Austin where it had no business being, and this time she did not qualify it, did not add an explanation or a hedge or a parenthetical acknowledgement of the alternative interpretations, just wrote it as the fact it was, the unadorned and specific fact of it, the way a good witness writes what they observed. She wrote about the light on Bragg Road. She wrote about kneeling on the packed caliche and pressing the river stone into the earth, and saying out loud into the dark between the trees, "I stayed." She wrote about what it had felt like to say that, and to have the darkness receive it the way the darkness had received it, which was not dramatically, which was not with any particular flourish, but with the simple acknowledgement of something that was true and had been heard. One evening, Wendell said, "You have stopped covering your arm." She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." She said, "They are just marks. They are a record." He said, "Of what?" She thought about this. She said, "Of the day everything changed direction, even though I did not know it was changing direction at the time." He looked at the arm, at the 3 parallel lighter lines on the inside of her forearm, and he said, "A hawk did that." She said, "A hawk did that." He said, "While trying to save you." She said, "While trying to get its snake back." He said, "Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive." She looked at him across the dinner table. This man she had been across dinner tables from for 45 years. This man who did not take up a lot of space in any conversation, but whose presence in the space he did take up was always precisely and reliably himself. And she felt for him something she could not have named adequately before this summer, something that was more specific than love in the general sense, something that had to do with the particular miracle of the particular person, the specific improbable fact of this person, and no other person having been the one who turned off the tractor, and looked at her face and got in the truck and drove without asking which direction. She said, "I need to tell you something." He set down his fork. She said, "I am going to do this work, the work Ruth does. I am going to finish the program in Beaumont, and I am going to do this work in this county. And I am going to do it for a long time." He said, "I know." He said, "I have been married to you for 45 years. I have driven you at speeds I am not going to confirm to a hospital with a snake in the air and a hawk on your arm. I am aware of who you are. I have been aware of who you were becoming for the last several months, and I have been waiting for you to catch up to what I could already see." She looked at him. He picked up his fork. He said, "I am proud of you. Are we finished with the speech portion of the evening?" She said, "Yes." She left Ruth's house in the late morning of that March visit with a list of 3 books, the name of a woman in Beaumont who ran a home funeral certification program, and the particular quality of purpose that settles into a person when the thing they have been moving toward finally comes far enough into focus to be named. And driving back along the county road with the pines going by on both sides, she passed the highway turnoff for Bragg Road and did not slow down, because she did not need to, because some thresholds, once crossed, do not require you to stand at them again. That evening, at the kitchen table, she opened the gray notebook to a blank page, and she looked at it for a long time, not from uncertainty, but from the specific quality of attention that precedes an honest beginning, the gathering of breath before the first word. And then she wrote, at the top of the page, a title that arrived complete and without revision. She wrote what the sky kept. Then she began. Outside in the yard she had been negotiating with all summer, a red-tailed hawk landed on the fence post at the property's edge and sat there in the September light with the complete stillness of a creature that has arrived exactly where it intended to arrive and stayed for the length of time it needed to stay, and then lifted and was gone, and Marlene did not see it because she was writing, but Wendell did from the kitchen doorway, and he stood watching the empty fence post for a long moment afterward and said nothing to anyone, and held what he had seen the way you hold something that belongs to someone else, and that you are keeping safe until the right moment to give it back. And the world went on doing what the world does, which is to be exactly and precisely and irreducibly itself, in all its attention, in all its patience, in all its willingness to keep giving back what it has been given. She got out of the truck and went inside to change. Somewhere in the pines at the property's edge, A single bird was singing a song she did not know the name of, clear and unhurried and specific, and it sang it all the way to the end.